The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Before I call the Honourable Member for Gower to open the debate, I wish to make a short statement about the sub judice resolution. I have been advised that the petition that is being debated today indirectly relates to two ongoing legal cases in the Scottish courts. These cases are ongoing and therefore open to sub judice. Mr Speaker, however, has agreed to exercise the discretion given to the Chair in respect of the resolution on matters with sub judice to allow reference to the cases given the issues of national importance that they raise. And can I also remind members that this debate will be conducted with courtesy and respect. Order, order. Tonia Antoniazzi to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it is an honour to serve in this chamber. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petitions 623243 and 627984 relating to the definition of sex in the Equality Act 2010. I'm pleased to open this debate on two petitions on behalf of the Petitions Committee. One calls on the Government to update the Equality Act to make the characteristic sex is biological sex, and the other to commit to not amending the Equality Act's definition of sex. Opinions about the relationship between biological sex, gender identity and the law divide organisations, political parties, even family and friends. Many have told me that this is something that they are afraid to speak of, and some say it should not be discussed at all. Others have told me how they are relieved and happy that we are finally discussing it in Parliament. I'd like to make progress. Thank you. Okay.
Giving way so early on, but on the point that she makes around people being scared to talk about it, I would ask her if she's also aware of people like my constituents who've also written to me say they are scared that it is going to be talked about. Because whenever such things are spoken about in Parliament, there then is a rise in hatred and violence. And I thank you, Madam Chair, for your words about being courteous. But does she understand the worry in some communities that this debate is happening? And would she urge other members to stay compassionate and open-minded in this debate?
I think the honourable member will, when she listens to my speech, will understand the compassion with which I speak, but also understand that we are in a very difficult position. We are legislators, and where there is something that needs to be addressed, as it is in these two petitions, then I think it is up to us to stand up to make that change and to have the conversation. It goes with the job, I'm afraid, Madam Speaker, Chair. So, members from all sides today can model the respectful adult conversations that are needed across society. We can demonstrate that here at Westminster we can freely express and listen to different opinions. This is a set of issues on which views are held profoundly, and they are held with good intentions. And the nature of this debate means that these views differ across the House and even within our own respective parties. I've been in education for 20 years before coming to this place. My priority has always been the well-being of those in my care, be they adults or children. Asking probing and difficult questions to get through issues and problems, I'm afraid that is in my nature. And I won't be cowed by looking out for my constituents, be they lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans. The conversations I get the most out of are the ones where I explore and learn and am able to disagree agreeably. It is a mark of adult politics not to pretend that we are in perfect agreement on every issue, and Westminster Hall debates like this offer the opportunity for us to explore issues free from the usual pressures of votes and the instructions of the whips. It is a debate that will explore the difficult interrelationships that exist between rights, and it will mark the difficulties of lines between which individuals and collective rights are drawn. However, it is for this House to decide the way those rights are formed and how they are interpreted. This debate is one we hold on behalf of individual people facing discrimination and in support of service providers and public servants that have a deep commitment to reduce discrimination and to provide safe and welcoming environments. Our task is to make decisions on the boundary of rights and to take responsibility rather than passing it on. Now, we may draw different conclusions from historic debates on the legislation, but our responsibility is to make our decisions on what would be the right law to have now. And in order to prepare for this debate, the committee clerks arranged for me to meet with the petitioners and organisations supporting both of these petitions, and I thank them all for their time and their input. The House of Commons Library has also produced a debate pack which covers the complexity of the legal issues behind these two petitions. And I'm most grateful to everyone that's spoken to me, because these were two broad positions. Those who support the petition to update the Equality Act say that the law should be clear about the two sexes, and that it was never the intention of the Equality Act to make that difficult or impossible, to have sports that are for biological females only, to protect services that are for women, such as domestic violence refuges, or assure an elderly woman or a woman getting a smear test that, when they ask for a female carer or nurse, that she will have the right to be treated biological woman. A biological woman, not a logical woman. So, and also to provide single-sex spaces where women are undressing and washing, for same-sex attracted people opportunities to associate with each other, and for public sector equality duty to consider the needs of women separately from trans women. Now, speaking with Kate Barker from the LGB Alliance, Julie Bindle and Tamara Burrows from the Lesbian Project, who support the clarification of the Act, they explained to me that the protected characteristic of sexual orientation is also contingent on the definition of sex as biological, and that the Act did not intend to remove the rights of association for same-sex attracted lesbians. For the lesbians that I met, I heard how biological sex is fundamental to understanding their rights as same-sex attracted people. So this grey area that we have is creating ongoing problems for lesbians. If we don't say that sex in the Equality Act means sex, then we may as well scrap the protections of sexual orientation. They said that the protected characteristic of gender reassignment exists. Trans people are able to hold their own separate groups under the protected characteristic, and can also associate with lesbian groups already open to them. So the question posed was, why cannot lesbians organise lesbian-only spaces? The Lesbian Project is an organisation who want to research and study lesbian lives and survey lesbians. If trans women are included in it, it renders the research meaningless and pointless. This is not, I was told, about being anti-trans. It was about the bedrock of being a lesbian, and a lesbian is a female attracted to females. It was highlighted that there must be protections for trans people, but not at the expense of women's rights. It is becoming a barrier to lesbians in coming out, and this, for them, is a huge problem. So the question for many is, should women be allowed female-only associations? Should it be easy and straightforward for women to be able to undress, shower, and use a toilet in female-only spaces? Those that want the Equality Act to stay as it is say that trans people are already using services for the opposite sex without concern whether they have a gender recognition certificate or not. And not allowing them, would be harmful, and it would be detrimental to their human rights. And it is therefore the responsibility of society and lawmakers to ensure that people are able to access opposite-sex facilities, services and sports. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr Finn McKee, Robin Moira-White, Dr Paul Martin and Nancy Kelly for taking the time to speak to me and to explain the situation for for their petition. Well, it's not their petition, but for that petition. Because where this causes a problem, it's likely to be very rare, and the transgender person may be excluded on an individualised case-by-case basis. Some of those arguing for no change to the Act believe that trans women are women and trans men are men, and that therefore...
Order. This is suspended for 15 minutes for a division in the House. For 2 divisions. Thank you. Order, order. The sitting is resumed. The debate will now continue up to 7:55 p.m. Tonia Antoniazzi to continue her speech.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just go back a sentence or so. Some of those arguing for no change to the Act believe that trans women are women and trans men are men, and that therefore the protected characteristic of sex includes those who identify as the opposite sex. Some also feel that it is an attack on the trans people to think or express disagreement with this belief. In support of this petition, Nancy Kelly from Stonewall said that she is proud of the Equality Act and that it works really well as legal sex, that it works well to operate trans-inclusive or not spaces, and emphasised how inclusion should be the norm. Defining legal sex as observed at birth would see inclusion rather than inclusion. And I also had the opportunity to speak to Barrister Robin Moira-White, who explained to me how this amendment was a blunt instrument. In fact, it was called a sledgehammer, which was being presented as a simple solution. To move forward, Robin told me that there was no need to change the law, that there was a need for less toxicity, and that also this amendment did not consider the anomalous position of a pregnant trans man. I also spoke to Dr Finn McKee, who told me about the impact that this change in the law would have on gender non-conforming people. Finn said that she would like to see more case studies from the EHRC on single-sex spaces, and she agreed with the government position and had said the current rhetoric is dangerous. We also need to have better public amenities that work for all people with inclusion as the default. Both petitions received over 100,000 signatures, and we all have constituents who are passionately on either side of these petitions. As well as the service providers that say they badly need clarity about the law, and others that say this current situation is okay for them. It is important that we are having this debate today. So as well as supporters of both petitions, I spoke to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, whose job it is to protect everyone's rights and to explain the Equality Act. They said the law can be hard to implement, and don't we know it? Their letter to the Minister for Women and Equalities states a change to the Equality Act 2010 so that the protected characteristic of sex means biological sex could bring clarity in a number of areas, but potential ambiguity in others. Both the government and the opposition welcomed the EHRC statement that, and the current situation merits further consideration and exploration of possible solutions. The EHRC said there is a clear need to move the public debate on issues of sex and gender to a more informed and constructive basis. I was told that this issue, and I know, has been bubbling away for many years and was not anything new. In 2018, the Women and Equalities Committee asked the EHRC to create statutory guidance on single-sex spaces, which it published much later in 2022. However, the guidance placed a large onus on service providers to exclude people who are legal women. It was when this escalated in 2018 that the UK and Scottish governments started talking about proposals to reform the Gender Recognition Act, which started the debate about self-ID. They said that the landscape since the Equality Act had changed significantly. There are more gender identities. Yes, I will.
I appreciate it. She's making a good speech balance so far. Would she recognise that when the Equalities Act was being passed, the Lib Dem spokeswoman at that time, asked our minister from the Labour Party if this was the first step to understanding self-ID and moving towards those steps in Hansard. So this is an issue that was thought of at the very time of the Equalities Act being created, and the affirmative response was given to that question at that time.
I thank the Honourable Member for his contribution, but at the moment there are more gender identities and more trans people who have no intention of getting gender recognition certificates. They also said that the situation for people who identify as non-binary is very unclear, and that a change to the legislation would provide clarity and a framework for moving forward. They said, however, that the government would need to scrutinise how trans people would feel about the change. They also identified the following key areas of concern for the public: NHS and medical treatment, toilets, sport in schools and children's rights, and women's domestic abuse shelters. On talking about a way forward, they said that debate needs to be more informed and constructive. Aqua Reindorf said that we need some shared facts in the debate. Baroness Kishwa said that the government should publish its proposals and then set up a joint committee to look at it first and ask all the questions. She said that this would be a sensible approach. Baroness Kishwa also said that she hoped people would not shoot the messenger. The EHRC provided analysis for the government, and it is to parliamentarians to make decisions. But I'd like to go to the petitioners. One of the petitioners said to me, and wished to remain nameless, "We want legal protections. We want the Conservative government to stop using us as a distraction to pull hate away from their failures. But our hopes are not confined to the Equality Act. The main struggle most trans people face is not what legal protections we are afforded post-transition, but access to the means to transition in the first place." I'm taking a quote from Maya Forstater, who was also a petition creator. She said that the reason she's trying to clarify the law is that the law is made clear and that sex discrimination and discrimination against transgender people are two different strands of equality protection. That way, employers and service providers will be able to protect individuals against both kinds of discrimination and treat everyone with respect. In that spirit, Madam Chair, I am proud to open this debate, and I urge my colleagues to speak openly, fearlessly, and with respect for each other and for the different experiences of people in this country who are looking to us as legislators to take responsibility. I hope that we will have a constructive debate about how the needs and interests of everyone who is impacted by the Equality Act should be reconciled in legislation. Thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate, and also that those who wish to speak should have been present at the outset when the opening debate was actually opened. The question is that this House has confirmed E-petitions 623, 243 and 627-984 relating to the definition of sex in the Equality Act 2010. And I call Janel Ray Wardana.
Thank you, Mrs Cummings. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the Honourable Lady, the Member for Gower, for opening this debate. As I see it, the debate on women's rights is much too important to be left to social media alone. I'm a father with two young daughters, so this issue is very close to my heart, and I think it's the job of Parliament to make sure that laws are clear and fair. It's our duty, and we have an opportunity to protect children, to uphold women's rights, and to bring about the beginning of the end, I hope, for the shouting matches and hyperbole, replacing them with some calm and common sense on the issues that have been raised by these petitions. I know not everyone will agree with what I'm about to say, but that's the point of Parliament. We should all be able to air our views freely and fairly, and the government should act accordingly. Today's debate on one petition is about a very specific point of law, but the point is widely felt. The legal definition of sex matters in so many areas of life: schools, sports, health, crime, and prisons. I want the rules of our society to be safe, clear, and fair for my daughters as much for women and girls across Britain. A policy exchange report, Asleep at the Wheel, found that 60% of schools are not maintaining single-sex sports. 19% of schools are not maintaining single-sex changing rooms, and 28% are not maintaining single-sex lavatories. Such provision at school, I believe, is absolutely essential for the privacy, dignity and safety of pupils. And a further policy exchange report, Mrs Cummings, Gender Identity and the NHS, found that North Bristol NHS Trust was not willing to guarantee same-sex intimate care or same-sex accommodation to patients, stating, and I quote, that these arrangements meet all national standards relating to single-sex accommodation. And this is despite the Trust's biggest hospital recording up to 30 alleged instances of sexual assault against females having taken place on hospital property. So the way I see it today is we need to ask ourselves three questions. Do we want women and girls to be forced or shamed into sharing loos, changing rooms and dormitories with biological men and boys? Do we want women and girls to lose female-only sports, even though we know that the physical advantages of being male relate to sex, not gender identity? And do we want some of the most vulnerable people in our society, children in care homes, patients in hospitals, women in homeless shelters, rape crisis centres, or indeed prisons, to have the dignity, safety and privacy of single-sex spaces stolen away from them? I say no. But that's what happens if the law is ambiguous about the meaning of sex. And I don't want schools, doctors, hospitals or the police to have to lie to me or to other parents because they've been bullied or shamed into thinking that it's bigoted to use clear words. So I just want to make a plea for a return to everyday common sense language. And to be clear, this does not take away from the rights of anyone to live as they choose. The words for people who were born male are men and boys. The words for people who are born female are women and girls. Biologically, males cannot become females and vice versa. And this is true, whatever pronouns that people might want to use for themselves, of course, whether they wish to take hormones or have surgery. These are plain biological facts, but they have become controversial. Now, many people tell me that you have to be brave to say them. That's wrong. Everyone should be able to. But if it is anyone's job, then I believe it is our job, here in this place, to harness this place, to speak out and speak the truth, to stand up, I believe, for everyone's rights. And that means using clear, accurate, unambiguous words, both in our speeches today and in the law. Surely no one here wants to take away from anyone's ability to express themselves as they wish, identify as they feel is right, to live their own life. I don't. But rights come with responsibilities. And that's why we must be clear about what it is we are legislating for. And that brings me to the specifics of the proposed amendment in the petition. It concerns the Equality Act, which is the law about discrimination, sex discrimination, age discrimination, religious discrimination, and so on. And this amendment is primarily about one strand, sex discrimination. The petition asks the government to clarify in law, for the avoidance of doubt, that the term sex discrimination in the Equality Act means what it always has, discrimination because of the sex someone is, male or female. Having a gender recognition certificate doesn't make biological males female or biological females male. So it does not make a difference when it comes to sex discrimination. That's it. We're just making sure that the Equality Act aligns with reality. This is not a new principle. It's not about what's said on social media or on the so-called culture wars. It was in 1597, Mrs. Cummings, that Thomas Cook, the Attorney General, told Parliament that the law cannot do the impossible. The example he used was that the law cannot make a man into a woman. I believe he was right then, and he is right now. Let me be crystal clear. To agree this amendment does not take away any rights from anyone else. There is already a separate protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Someone covered by this already has the protection, rightly, against losing their job or being refused a tenancy or service because of being transgender. I remember when my first daughter was born. We didn't find out before, so there was a 50-50 chance. It is basic biology. We all know what the two sexes are. We all know which sex we are and what sex our children are. I will.
Just very, very briefly. Does he accept that intersex people exist?
I'm sure that she will deal with that in her comments, and that she will be staying for this whole debate. I want to conclude my remarks so that other members can have their say, and I want to talk about the fact that we all know which sex we are, what sex our children are, and we know that the two sexes, male and female, are fundamental to our very existence. So much has changed for women and girls from 400 years ago with Thomas Cook, and even 50 years ago, when sex discrimination was first made unlawful in the United Kingdom. And so I simply ask the Minister, Mrs. Cummings, to make sure that the law does not try and do the impossible. It is up to us. Let's not go backwards. And I urge the government to act now to protect the lives of women and girls.
And I ask members to limit their speeches to around 5 minutes so that everybody can get in. And I call Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mrs. Cummings. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship. I'm supporting the prayer of the first petition, which is about restoring clarity to the law by specifying that the terms sex, male, female, man and woman in the Equality Act refer to biological sex and not sex as modified by a gender recognition certificate. My Edinburgh South West constituency was one of the 5 constituencies with the highest number of signatories on that petition. The other 4 were the remaining 4 Edinburgh constituencies. And I think this indicates the level of concern in Scotland's capital city about the lack of clarity of the law as it stands, particularly in the light of the debate about self-identification in Scotland. Now, given that I have only 5 minutes, I'm going to concentrate on one particular topic, but I just want to say that the petition which I support is not about changing the Equality Act, it's about clarifying the Equality Act, whereas the second petition wants to leave the law muddled, and that is in nobody's interests. The Equality Act attempted to strike reasonable balances between the rights of people with 9 different protected characteristics. Those include sex, sexual orientation and gender reassignment. And the protected characteristic of gender reassignment is widely drawn, and rightly so. It's rightly not confined to those who have undergone medical treatment or indeed those who have a GRC. All transgender people are protected against discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment. That is right, and there's no intention to remove that protection, and I wouldn't support any petition that did that. But there is a need for the law to be clarified. That's shown by 2 recent court cases in Scotland which have gone in opposite directions. One, which was a decision of the Scottish Appeal Court, found that the provisions in favour of women by definition exclude those who are biologically male. Another decision of a lower court found that sex is not limited to biological or birth sex, but includes those in possession of a gender recognition certificate. Now, the second decision is not binding on any of the lower courts, and it is under appeal at the moment. But I don't see why women should have to crowdfund to clarify the law that protects them when the government can use the power built into the Gender Recognition Act by Section 23 to resolve the issues and protect everyone's rights. Now, before I go any further, I just want to refer briefly to my register of interests that I'm on the advisory group of Sex Matters. And I do believe that sex matters, and many people agree with me. The Equality and Human Rights Commission agree with me. The consultation for their strategic plan revealed that out of all protected characteristics, sex was important to the highest proportion of respondents. And very interestingly, Madam Chairwoman, last week, when the report of the Scottish Government's independent strategic review of funding and commissioning of violence against women and girls services was published, it recommended that single-sex provision should remain as part of a range of services. And one of their interlocutors said this: it is possible to be pro-women and not anti-anyone else. Now, in the short time I have, I want to focus in particular on the rights of lesbians and gay men to be same-sex and not same-gender identity attracted, and our right to freedom of association. The protected characteristic of sexual orientation is contingent on the definition of sex as meaning biological sex. Lesbians, gay men and bisexual people all experience same-sex attraction. That is, attraction based upon biological sex, not gender identity. And as a lesbian, I think I can speak with some authority on this issue. Gender identity is not relevant to sexual attraction. In recent years, Stonewall has quietly modified their definition of homosexuality to centre around gender identity and not sex. That was done without the permission of many gay people across the UK. And now that they also explicitly include cross-dressers within that within the definition of transgender, this means that many males now self-define as lesbians. And under this climate, it's impossible for lesbians to meet and gather openly without men wishing to join us or disrupt our events. Now, in the words of Anne Lister, lesbians love and only love the fairer sex. It's unacceptable that we should be forced to include men in our groups and our dating pool. Indeed, it's outright homophobia, and lesbian sexual orientation is exclusive of males as it's based on biological sex. I spoke about this during the debate in LGBT History Week to say what a problem this is for lesbians, and I quoted my constituent Sally Wainwright, who wrote at length about this in the Times. And just before I sit down, Madam Chairwoman, I want to say something to honourable members who will perhaps this evening be influenced by the Equality Network's briefing in support of the second petition. In Scotland, the Equality Network has lobbied Scottish parliamentarians for self-identification of sex, saying it had nothing to do with the Equality Act. But now today, they're lobbying members of this Parliament for a position which would annihilate the ability of women to have any clubs or associations which cannot exclude all male people. The Equality Network has in the past lobbied this Parliament to remove the very exemptions in the Equality Act upon which it is relying today. So honourable members should be aware that the Equality Network may have a grand inclusive-sounding name, but on this issue, it advocates for a position based on an extreme interpretation of gender identity theory and not for the interests of same-sex attracted women like me and my constituent Sally, or indeed for women full stop. As my friend Alison Bailey has said, the rights of lesbians are not contingent on us accepting gender identity theory. It's time, Madam Chairwoman, that lesbians and the protected characteristic of sexual orientation regained the voice it once had in this Parliament. I'm proud to be that voice, and I want to thank organisations like LGB Alliance, Lesbian Labour, the Lesbian Project and the Women's Rights Network for supporting me to be that voice, and I support the first petition.
I'm going to call Miriam Cates, but before I do, can I just tell people that we're going to have a time limit of 5 minutes. Miriam Cates.
When the Equality Act was passed in 2010, few doubted Parliament's intention was that sex should mean biological sex, either male or female, recorded at birth, an immutable characteristic. However, uncertainty has since arisen, specifically as to whether or not a person with a gender recognition certificate has legally changed their sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. And whatever the law actually says, the extent of the confusion is such that many people now believe that when someone expresses a desire to live as the opposite sex, that person then has a legal right to be treated as if they have changed sex. Now, this is not an academic argument. It has significant practical and safeguarding implications, as the outstanding work of Policy Exchange's Biology Matters Unit continues to reveal. Take the example of a tribunal brought against Sheffield Teaching Hospitals Trust last year. A male catering employee, known as V, who identified as a trans woman, was given permission to use female changing rooms. When female staff complained about being forced to undress with V, in particular seeing him naked from the waist down, the issue was raised with V by a female manager. In response, V brought a harassment case against the Trust and, unbelievably, won. Instead of considering whether the manager acted reasonably in being concerned about the exposure of male genitals in the ladies' changing room, the judge decided that V had been treated differently from another woman. The judge treated V as if his sex was female, when the issue in question was the fact that his body was male. Of course, the women who complained about V were not discriminating against him due to his trans identity. They were discriminating against him because he was male. And this discrimination is, of course... It is a concluded case. They were discriminating against him because he was male, and this discrimination is, of course, perfectly legal within the Equality Act, if it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, in this case to protect the integrity of single-sex spaces. Now, I have nothing for compassion for people whose biological sex is a source of distress, and they should, of course, receive the best evidence-based treatments for gender dysphoria. But whilst a small number of people rightly have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, everyone, including trans people, has the protected characteristic of sex, male or female. And where these protected characteristics collide, we must ensure that everyone is protected according to their sex and that proportionate accommodations are made to assist those who don't wish to use the facilities of their sex. So, Mrs Cummings, we must clarify the Equality Act to make clear that sex means biological sex and to ensure that the providers of single-sex services and facilities understand and protect the single-sex nature of these provisions. But it is quite extraordinary that in 2023, in a time of unprecedented knowledge, we are arguing about the definition of something that has been known since the dawn of time. The most contentious question of our day has famously become, what is a woman? A question that no previous society has felt the need to answer. Because despite the semantic acrobatics employed by some to dodge the question, we all know, instinctively, intrinsically, what a woman is. Because the sex binary, the biological state of being either male or female, evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years before we humans walked the earth. Being able to tell the difference between a man and a woman is not a matter of acquired knowledge. It is as instinctive as being able to tell up from down. Indeed, our survival as a species depends on it. If you want to reproduce, if you want to protect yourself, if you want to protect your children, you had better know the difference between a man and a woman. Men and women are different, physically, psychologically, sexually and socially. All civilizations are built on an understanding of these differences, creating structures and rules and boundaries to protect women and children from male violence and to preserve the dignity of both sexes. There is nothing more destabilising to society than to dismantle the legal, social and cultural guardrails that protect women and children by pretending that males become females and vice versa and allowing that to creep into our law. Whilst academic elites cave in to aggressive and misogynistic trans activism, ordinary women are frightened to go to hospital. Ordinary men fear for the safety of their daughter in public toilets. Ordinary children are subjected to a psychological experiment in which they are told they can choose their gender, and ordinary toddlers are used to satisfy the sexual fetish of adult men dressed as eroticised women. Understanding the difference between male and female underpins society, safety and security. We must clarify the Equality Act to give ordinary people the certainty that our laws can be trusted to protect women and children and that sex means sex.
Point of order.
Sorry, I feel it incumbent upon me to make a point of order on the fact that trans people are being characterised as predators. And that is deeply undemocratic and deeply worrying in this debate. That is not what this debate is about. And for the member to be using language like that in terms like that is unparliamentary. I seek your guidance.
I'll deal with this point of order first. That's not a point of order because it's not a matter for the chair. Point of order, Miriam Kerr.
Point of order. In response to the lady's intervention, I was making the point that the vast majority of sexual predation happens by men on women and children, and those are the rules that society has evolved to protect against.
Again, I thank you for that point of order, but it's not a matter for the chair. I now call Dame Angela Eagle.
We tried to detoxify this debate. I don't think that last contribution did so at all. In fact, it was deliberately provocative. And I have to say, I don't recognise that anywhere in the Equality Act there's a mandation on anyone's dating pool and who should be in it. I think that if people are worried about having the law say who they can date, then they are certainly not around in the UK legislative system where there are no laws on who you can fancy. and who should be in your dating pool. You can trawl wide or narrow across all. No, I'm not going to give it. I've only got 4 minutes. But, you know, this is putting together things that are deliberately provocative. I'm rising to speak in this debate in favour of petition number 627984, which asks the government to confirm that the Equality Act's current definition of sex should remain unchanged. I believe the move to redefine sex as purely biological rather than legal would reduce rather than enhance current protections and create incoherence in the legislation. Paradoxically, perhaps even deliberately, it would mandate exclusion and discrimination against all trans people, whilst worsening protections for women and girls, would effectively practically disapply the important parts of the Gender Recognition Act and be in breach of our international human rights organisation obligations. It would take away rights which have been enjoyed by the small minority of our population who are trans for almost 20 years, and there are 7,000 people who have a gender recognition certificate. That's who we're afraid of in all of this. A change to the Equality Act's definition of sex to biological sex would have a huge effect on all trans people by effectively mandating their exclusion from public spaces unless they use facilities in their so-called birth gender, which would be humiliating and damaging for them. And it would lead to the policing of women's spaces, which would problematise non-gender conforming women and girls who are not trans. And that is happening now with all the hostility. Indeed, the hysterical media coverage which has accompanied this deliberately provoked war on woke has already led to increased policing in public toilets and harassment of non-gender conforming women by those questioning their rights to be there. Now, I've spent my whole political life and my entire time in Parliament working to create greater equality for all and to reduce bigotry and prejudice. And always have been a committed feminist. The safety of women and the opening up of economic opportunities to them on an equal basis to that of men has always been one of my priorities in politics. I'm also a lesbian. I was only the second out lesbian ever to sit in this place, and the first ever out lesbian government minister, and so I have had some experience of bigotry, prejudice, misogyny and homophobia, and I recognise a politically induced moral panic when I see one. I also recognise a discredited government unleashing a culture war for its own divisive ends when I see it. Those seeking to weaponise anti-trans fear for their own purposes have other issues in their sights too. Principally, these are inclusive sex education and women's abortion rights, as we have seen in the USA, where over 400 anti-LGBTQ+ pieces of legislation have been introduced in state legislatures already this year. The attack on trans people's rights to exist and live with respect and dignity in an accepting society is designed as a wedge issue which will open up the others. It's a gateway to wider homophobia, as the steady rise in hostility to LGBTQ+ people in the street attests to. In fact, I was around when it happened before in the 1980s with the enactment of Section 28, which sought successfully to scapegoat LGBT+ young people and drive them into hiding. It caused untold misery for narrow political ends, wrecking the lives of LGBT+ people for generations, and we should not be contemplating doing it again. The Act is an all-encompassing piece of legislation. It was enacted to advance, consolidate, update the protections of equality law, and it's working very well. But it works by making a blanket presumption against discrimination and against exclusion. It specifies some circumstances in which discrimination is lawful so long as the action taken is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. That is a very pragmatic way of deciding on a complex range of issues in each case. If we change the definition, it would upend the Act and mandate exclusion for trans people, which I think is inhumane and unacceptable.
Call Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Ms. Your chairship today. I am speaking in support of the petition to make the Equality Act clear, and I want to start by saying why. It's because I believe that trans people's rights are human rights and women's rights are human rights. It is possible to protect both groups in law, and I believe that that is what the Equality Act sets out to do. But one unintended consequence of pulling together a lot of equality and anti-discrimination law into one place is that in places it is unclear, and that lack of clarity is harming people's rights. What we're discussing today is how to restore clarity in order to uphold the rights of everyone. I have huge respect and sympathy for people who suffer from gender dysphoria or who feel that they have been born in the wrong body. It is right that the law protects such people from discrimination in employment and the provision of services under the heading of gender reassignment. It is also right that the law protects everyone, whether they have a trans identity or not, from discrimination in employment and the provision of services on the basis of their sex. Gender reassignment and sex are two different characteristics, both important in their own ways and separately protected. The census suggests that there may be more than 100,000 people who identify as transgender in the country, compared with around 5,000 who hold a gender recognition certificate. All of those transgender people are protected in the same way on the basis of gender reassignment, which is drawn very widely. They have the same protected characteristics, which includes people who are at the start of a personal transition and people who have been identifying as trans for decades, people who have taken cross-sex hormones and had surgery, and people who haven't or do not intend to. People who pass as the other sex in some situations and people who don't. All of these people are protected equally. None of them have more or less rights than any of the others. In today's debate, it's really important that we remember what the Equality Act is and what it isn't. It's the law that gives a recourse to anyone who is treated unfairly by employers and service providers of all sorts because of their protected characteristics. And it's the law when it's reasonable and right for employers and service providers to treat people differently on the basis of their protected characteristics. Those employers and service providers, from pubs and gyms to hospitals and shops, cannot operate without clear rules and policies that accommodate all sorts of different people fairly, and to the greatest extent that they can. They need to be able to explain their rules on their signs and on their website, on the phone, and to staff. This means being clear about where there are sex-based rules and where a service is provided for both sexes together. The protected characteristic of gender reassignment does not give someone the right to use opposite-sex facilities or services. What it does is require service providers to consider how they can properly accommodate trans people. Not just trans people with a gender recognition certificate, but all trans people. All the people who are covered by gender reassignment. They can't do this fairly by treating trans people with and without a gender recognition certificate differently. And anyway, it's not practical, and in some cases it's not even lawful to ask if someone has a GRC. Here, in simple terms, is what the law needs to facilitate. That employers and service providers offer separate facilities for male and female people in situations where sex matters, like toilets, changing rooms, dormitories, and so on. And that they also do their level best to accommodate people who don't feel comfortable in communal facilities for their own sex, without undermining the privacy and dignity of people of the opposite sex. That usually means a third unisex option. And at this point, I must say that it doesn't mean converting the ladies' loos, for instance, into unisex and leaving the number of men's loos intact, as I've seen happen. Being a trans woman is a very specific experience, and it brings some challenges. Likewise, being born a woman is a very specific experience that also brings challenges. Both groups need and deserve fair and appropriate support and provision and protections against discrimination on the basis of their protected characteristics. This means being clear about what sex means, and being clear that it is not the same as gender reassignment or having a transgender identity. That is the right and compassionate way to ensure fairness and dignity for everyone.
Carl Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mrs Cummings. I just feel I have to say that I think that the status quo currently isn't working. People who are standing in this debate probably feel a little bit anxious about doing that, and that isn't a status quo that I would particularly recognise on either side if we have to have sides. Sex and gender are different. I've never met a trans person who denied this, or over the years of having very robust debates with them. And in my life, the discrimination I have suffered at the hands of establishments, rather than just, your everyday sexism, has always been exclusively because of my biology. The obvious examples I could give are about pregnancy, where I was told not to bother to turn up for interviews because of pregnancy scan appointments, or the fact that I was told I was too young to decide if I wanted to be sterilised at the age of 28, when my husband, just 3 years older than me, was allowed to make that decision without anybody batting an eyelid. I had to get 2 doctors to sign a thing to say that I could have an abortion. My biology really matters to me, and I have been treated poorly because of it. I, however, after making that point, want to really stress that my remarks are going to be about the issue of single-sex spaces and the safety of women. And I think I'm probably alone in this room of being somebody who has actually run single-sex spaces and used this part of the Equality Act we are here to debate. So, we all know violence against women and girls, men's violence against women and girls, it happens to women. It is, of course, it happens to men, and frankly, if you need a service because you are a victim of domestic or sexual violence, I do not care which category you fall into, you are entitled 100% to expect access to those services. But the Equality Act has to allow that we need different kinds of services for different people's needs, understandably. The Equality Act is a carefully balanced piece of legislation which recognises that women and men, and let's be honest, it's less men, need protection from sex discrimination. And as part of that, women need to be able to have separate services and associations, charities and sports. So the majority of victims of domestic violence are women, and they're much more likely to be seriously hurt or killed. We must be really careful to protect our intricate and finely balanced services for women. I am seeing again and again already, this is happening, where specialist women's services are being decommissioned in favour of generic support services that have an all-or-nothing approach. This has got almost nothing to do with trans people initially. It's entirely to do with the fact that they were expected to support men's services as well. And so they're decommissioning services, and you have situations where perpetrator and victim are in the same service, and that is happening all across the country. It is utterly devastating, and the government should be looking at commissioning of women's-only spaces in the procurement bill, which we have tomorrow. I'll look forward to everybody tomorrow who stands up and fights for women's-only services today, saying the same thing and not wanting the free hand of the market to decide, but to actually say that you want women's-only services, specialist women's services, because in the domestic abuse bill and in the online harms bill, the government refused to put the word women in it. It's funny how they're keen on it now. I shall be pushing everybody who speaks in this debate tomorrow to be voting on that basis. But organisations are afraid of funding, from getting funding, and authorities thinking that they have to have an all-or-nothing approach. This is a reality that we are already seeing. Part of the problem is the confusion and fear about the law, and believe me, it is our role as parliamentarians to sort that out, no matter how hard it might be. It cannot be left to the courts. It cannot be left to individual women's services to muddle through and fight legal battles. And believe me when I say this happens, it happened to my organisation when we were there because we refused to interview a man for a job. These are small organisations with very little in the way of support. The Public Service Equality Duty is one of the most important parts of the Equality Act, and it requires public service providers to consider the needs of different groups. When I was a Commissioner of Services on Birmingham City Council, insisted on the commissioning of domestic abuse services for LGBT victims. I insist on having specialist services for South Asian women where I live, for example. I think that we should have specialist services for disabled people because they have specific needs. At the moment, I feel that we are leaving some of these smaller organisations in a difficult situation, and along with Women's Aid nationally, I believe that you should be able to provide sex-only services, and other services must be available.
Hear, hear.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
Thank you. And I learnt a lot from most of the speeches, especially the last one. And anyone who has missed the annual list of women killed by men should actually attend. I'm indebted to 2 authors. One is Helen Joyce, who wrote the book Trans, subtitled Where Ideology Meets Reality. And I invite those who think that those of us who are speaking for clarity of the law are in any sense transphobic, or that any word or sentence in this book is that. The second book is by Helen Stock, who was a professor at the University of Sussex, in the county I have my constituency is, who wrote Material Girls, Why Reality Matters to Feminism. I first became conscious of her dilemmas when I read a remark by a man called Liam Hackett, who accused her publicly of being a dangerous extremist. There isn't a sentence in this book which can be regarded as transphobic. Liam Hackett was given an honorary degree by the University of Sussex in his 20s. He created and runs, so far as I know, still does, an organisation called Ditch the Label, which is an anti-bullying charity. And yet he is publicly a bully of a fine academic who should be supported and not condemned. Now, I could, of course, have brought one of J.K. Rowling's books, but in 5 minutes I can't go through a full literary review. In the end of at the end of Kathleen Stock's book, she has a chapter 8, A Better Activism in Future. She recommends being more non-binary. She recommends, when having these discussions, to stop changing the subject, to be more intersectional and have less theory and more data. Or expanded, she says, use less academic brackets high under brackets theory and use more academic data. And she's got a whole list of questions on which we ought to have information. She was writing the book when the questions for the 2021 census were being created, when something came in on trans identity. It was written in such a way that the place where there seemed to be most trans people were in East London, where the question was misunderstood. It's ludicrous that we can't have, when we search for data, we can't have proper data. I think that we ought to, first of all, recognise that no one that I know is transphobic. Secondly, having gender questions matters. Discussing trans issues matters. When sex and gender clash, sex should be the dominant one. And just to end quickly with 2 examples which are well known to everybody. Why should a cyclist who is the 500th fastest in his age group or category be allowed to declare themselves a woman and win a women's cycling race? There is no justification for that. There never was, and there never will be. And the second issue, as the Honourable Lady was pointing out, is that in places like prisons and hospitals and refuges and in personal care, people should have the opportunity and the expectation of being same-sex. For most things, of course, sex doesn't matter. It doesn't come into all these things. And my pronouns, the ones I normally use, are you, we, I. You don't have to go around saying I'm he and him the whole time. I answer to hi or any loud cry. I hope this debate will help to illuminate the fact that Parliament is taking this seriously. There are 1 or 2 people who have intervened who have given the impression that those who are speaking the way I do are in some way against trans people. That isn't so.
Call Rosie Duffield.
And it is a pleasure to speak in this debate and under your chairship. I rise to speak in favour of the motion to clarify the Equality Act. That's not exactly going to be a shock to anyone here. The debate over trans rights and women's rights has become toxic in recent years, partly because the law as it stands is not clear. In fact, without doubt, this is one of the most toxic issues politicians and campaigners will ever have been involved in. I experienced some pretty terrible online abuse during the height of the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, but I almost look back on those days fondly in comparison to the spite, vitriol, constant attacks, name-calling, trolling and the daily defamation I face personally, along with women's groups and my friends whose names are in the media every single day. If you talk to ordinary people, and elected politicians do so most days, they will tell you that women as a group need protection in law and trans women also need protection. But these are not the same groups, and this was recognised in the Equality Act when it was legislated. The Equality Act 2010 was one of the last measures of the last Labour government, of course, and it was the outcome of 14 years of campaigning by equality and human rights organisations. It's carefully balanced, and it had cross-party support for nearly all of its provisions. It's something we can be rightly proud of as a country, and it's a law that protects against sex discrimination and against transgender discrimination separately, because these are not the same thing. We know that 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. 2 women a week are killed by a current or former partner. 41% of women provide care for their children, grandchildren, to older and disabled people, compared to 25% of men. Around 90% of single parents are women. Men are almost twice as likely to be a manager, director or senior official than women, and only a third of MPs are women, despite us making up over 51% of the UK's population. Because of these and other differences in men and women's lives, we need to be able to monitor sex discrimination and provide for the needs of women and girls, particularly when they are most vulnerable. The Equality Act is the law that allows for this, but it is confusion within and about the Equality Act that has led to the toxic debate where people have become terrified to even talk about women's rights, but not all people. And since I started speaking up about this, I've had so many women and men write to me to say thank you, and many who've written to say that they're frightened to speak up for women's rights. These include women and men who work in jobs where it's extremely important that they are able to be clear about the difference between male and female, and about who women and who men are. These can be jobs that involve safeguarding children, head teachers, social workers. They include people who work in healthcare, nurses told that they should ensure that hospital accommodation is in single-sex bays for men and women, but also that they should allow people to choose which sex they want to be housed as. Women who work in domestic violence shelters, who are terrified of being sued or losing their jobs if they make clear that these are female-only spaces. Female athletes who want their sports to be fair but are afraid to speak up because of the response that they'll get. This was not the world that the Equality Act was meant to create. It was meant to continue on from the Sex Discrimination Act to ensure that men and women are treated equally, while single-sex services, sports associations and charities could be safeguarded. Instead, it's being used to stop people talking about sex, not gender, and sex discrimination. The Equality Act also meant to ensure that organisations should treat trans people fairly and with sensitivity, as employees and customers. But this did not mean requiring other people to pretend that they believe that being trans, for example, someone who's born male and perhaps changes their name, their clothes, who might take hormones or even have some physical surgery, is the same as being a woman. The Gender Recognition Act was passed to allow trans people to obtain legal status to marry in their acquired gender and to be treated as being male or female for the purpose of pensions. It did not, however, intend to provide an access all areas pass to single-sex services, associations, schools, colleges, sports or charities. We really need to offer clarity in this law, and it's the only way that that clarity means we can treat all people with respect. The UK has led the way on equality law, and it can do so again by finding a grown-up way through this debate on trans rights and women's rights. And until we do so, I will continue to speak up, death threats or not.
Yeah. Hear, hear, hear. I call Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. As we have heard, the petitioners want to make a simple amendment that would clarify the Equality Act with regard to the interpretation of the word sex. This clarification would prevent serious problems from continuing. Firstly, we are in a position where some biological males believe they have a right to enter single-sex spaces, female changing rooms. Now, I suspect that when many think of this, they think of a grown man, trans woman, entering a grown woman's space. This, to me, is obviously wrong. But my real concern is what happens when it's a 6-year-old girl that's in that changing room. Somebody's daughter, somebody's granddaughter, somebody's niece. It just isn't right. Now, I want to make an aside, and you will see where I am going. I've worked in construction most of my life. Health and safety over the last 30 years has taken a real turn for the better. We now report near misses. That is a report where an accident could have happened, but luckily didn't. maybe a tripping hazard scene or an oil spill. We do this to learn and to prevent accidents from taking place. Only put items in designated areas, or prevent the spill, or have spill kits on hand. This doesn't mean everyone was going to trip or slip, but some might. Therefore, we learn from a near miss and prevent an accident. Wise, I think we would all agree. So while our construction sites are getting safer, well done for the opposition for bringing in health and safety legislation, our single-sex spaces are not. So let's do what we need to do to clarify the Equality Act and make sure that no biological male can enter that 6-year-old girl's changing rooms. To me, this is excellent legislation and a must. A near miss reported to stop tragedy happening. This doesn't mean every biological male going into a female changing room was a danger, like not everyone was going to trip or slip. But it means some might, and therefore we say no, and prevent the possibility of something bad happening. This is why I support this petition, and I hope the government will too. However, I can also use this analogy on a near miss when it comes to women's sport. If we don't make this change right now, we could quite easily end up with no women's sport. Many young girls will see what is happening. Biological males winning in female sports, or perhaps a woman or girl being injured, and think, what's the point in trying? So let's sort out the Equality Act right now and protect our women's sport for good. In school, if we can stop the use of new gender pronouns, we will stop many issues for our young people later in life too. I'm glad we've been able to discuss this near miss today. I hope we can learn from this and prevent the tragedies that could follow if we don't. And for all those that think it's unfair, let me assure you, I believe we need to help and support those with gender dysphoria and treat them with respect too. But we need to do it while respecting other rights. And I feel I have to stand up for the 6-year-old girl in the changing room, the one who is confronted with a 50-year-old male who is going through a tough time. I'm standing up for the 9-year-old who wants to stand in first place at the Olympics, but thinks, what's the point when a biological man will be there in her place? I am standing up for that 12-year-old allowed to use pronouns at school, who is being told a story that she can be something that she never can. I am thinking her after her transition, when she wakes up one morning, when she's 25, and realises she can no longer have children. There's growing facial hair, her health is generally poor, bone density down, voice broken, no real friends, probably fell out with mum, who is now broken for letting her take those puberty blockers and hormone replacement tablets. I'm thinking of that girl sold a lie by the influencers who have now moved on to another ideology to make them money. No, in this place, we have to make the hard decisions to protect the vulnerable. I know the government will make the right decision and clarify the Equality Act.
Dame Neil Griffith.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir George. Well, the Equality Act of 2010 protects against direct and indirect discrimination, but there's always been provision in the Act for different treatment where it's proportionate means to allowing a legitimate aim. That is, different provision for those whose sex is assigned at birth and those whose legal sex has been acquired through a gender recognition certificate. So, for example, although I know of one rape crisis service which provides women-only services and has been doing for 30 years and uses trans-inclusive language and has been trans-inclusive for 30 years, many other organisations providing services for those who've suffered domestic violence use the current provision in the Equality Act to provide exclusive services for those whose sex at birth was female. Now, decisions about who can compete in sports can be determined by sporting bodies as appropriate for that sport. And I do not understand why so many members do not seem to have understood that is decided. And obviously rugby is totally different from chess, and those decisions are made by those appropriate bodies. Now, the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, in combination with the Equality Act 2010, currently defines someone's legal sex as being either the sex they were assigned at birth or the sex they've acquired through having a gender recognition certificate under the GRA. And as I've illustrated, the Equality Act for
allows for that different treatment between people whose legal sex has been acquired through the gender recognition certificate and people whose sex was assigned at birth, as long as the action is proportionate, a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. But if we have the change that has been suggested from the current definition in the Act to a definition as biological sex, this would create a blanket ban on trans people from services they'd previously enjoyed without concern or complaint, even when it cannot be said to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. This would remove the current protection from discrimination of people currently in possession of a gender recognition certificate and undermine the Gender Recognition Act, leading to people being treated as if they had not changed their sex. Now, unfortunately, this debate has often been portrayed as a matter of whether trans women should be allowed to use women's toilets. Well, firstly, we've had the GRA since 2004, and trans women have been using women's toilets without complaint. Most of us have never probably even noticed. As we know, we have individual cubicles, so everyone has their privacy. Then even more unfortunately, even by members in this debate, there has been a conflation of trans women and somebody who is a criminal. We know perfectly well that we have seen police who are criminals, who carry out heinous acts, but that does not mean to say that all police officers are criminals. And it's exactly the same. You know, you can have a meter reader or a council worker, impersonating someone of that nature, going to a house and trying to get entry into a house by false means. And so the idea that because somebody can dress up as a woman and therefore, carry out whatever criminal act they intend to, why that should determine how we decide to treat trans women, to me, is absolutely indecipherable. And I would just say to those people who genuinely feel they do not want to discriminate against trans people, I just want to quote to you just how hurtful this suggestion is to many trans people. They feel that they are going to be completely obliterated, that they will no longer exist, that they will no longer have the right to recognition. They have so many challenges in life, challenges with their family, challenges at work, challenges with their social life. I'll give it away very quickly.
Thank the lady for giving way, and I commend her on making a passionate and common sense contribution to this debate, because I'm sure she will agree with me that some of what we have heard today is just feeding into the moral panic. Some of the arguments are cut and paste from what gay and lesbian people faced decades ago. Does she agree with me that as a lesbian, trans people do not threaten us? In fact, they enhance our existence.
Well, absolutely. As a fellow lesbian, I absolutely agree with her. They're absolutely not a threat. And more importantly than that, they need our support now more than ever. Thank you.
In the chair, I want to talk about a specific situation in which clarity about the meaning of sex is utterly essential. A situation when it's vital that everybody knows what the words male and female mean, and when it's vital that these words have their natural meanings, the immutable binary characteristic that all humans and indeed all mammals possess from the beginning of their life to the end. I want to talk about the concept. I follow the example of your colleague behind you and not do so. I also want to talk about the consequences of when there's a lack of clarity about what happens when our laws mix up material, concrete, physical realities with words and claims about identity. And the reason I want to do that is because the consequences can be horrific. When legislators make mistakes, it's ordinary people who suffer, and our laws have to be clear, and in situations where sex matters, it's sex that matters. People can identify however they like, as long as claims about their identity don't injure other people. But injuring other people is what's happening now, because our laws have drifted away from reality and in the process have got muddled. And it's well past time to return to clarity and reality, and doing that means clarifying that when the Equality Act says sex, it really means sex. We're at a juncture where we've got to draw a line in the sand of competing claims. I ask my honourable colleagues to think of a stark but perfectly commonplace example of a situation where sex matters, that of a woman who is having a gynecological procedure. Perhaps she's having a cervical smear test, or she needs a hysterectomy in which a camera is passed through her vagina and cervix into her uterus. And for such procedures, she must take her clothes off from the waist down and be touched intimately. And many, many women are unwilling to go through such procedures except with female health workers. Some women have specific reasons. They're survivors of sexual assaults, or their religion requires them to avoid intimate contact with any man except their husband. Others are simply setting their own boundaries on the basis of what's comfortable for them, and their feelings for privacy and dignity are perfectly normal and a perfectly sound basis for them to grant or withhold consent. So here's the start question in clear language. Is a man who identifies as a woman a satisfactory person to provide care to this female patient who has stated that she is willing to undergo such a procedure only at the hands of another woman? And here's what the NHS Confederation said in guidance sent to the country last week. Despite the express wishes of the patient, that man is a suitable person to provide care to that woman. His feelings about his identity override the material reality of intimate contact with her body. They override her privacy, her dignity, her boundaries and her consent. And if she complains, she's transphobic and she may be asked to leave the hospital or surgery. And if her relatives speak up for her, they may be removed. All of that's dressed up in the language of gender identity. The patient has no right to know the health worker's gender identity. But it isn't the identity of this man the woman's concerned about, it's his sex. The NHS Confederation's not an outlier. The British Medical Association, which regulates doctors, says that patients have no right to be told a healthcare worker's assigned sex at birth. However, there isn't a sex assigned at birth. There is the only sex observed at birth determined by conception. And moreover, if a patient has asked for a carer of the same sex as them, according to the BMA, it's the comfort of the staff member that should be prioritised. No. Oh, yes, sorry.
Mistaken idea.
Right.
Does he agree with me that the guidance he's reading out is simply wrong in law, and to force a woman to accept a male-bodied person to carry out her intimate care is not just a breach of the Equality Act, but it's also a breach of that woman's rights under the Human Rights Act, in particular her right under Article 8 and also her right under Article 3.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's exactly why this clarity is needed. Because those are quotes from BMA guidance. And here's another one. The patient has no right to be told that the person treating them is trans or non-binary. In other words, the patient has no right to know whether the person treating them is the same sex as them. This is heartless beyond words. We're talking about a woman who may be worrying about serious illness, who's feeling exposed and vulnerable. And professional bodies are instructing healthcare providers to gaslight her. They're saying it's perfectly fine for a man to touch her unclothed private parts when she's refused that, because that's how he identifies. And as the Honourable Member has said, it's more than heartless, it's illegal. If a man provides such care to a woman who says she's only willing to receive it from another woman, it's a sexual assault. And so have we reached the point where medical associations are instructing care providers to sexually assault women in the name of inclusion? This is clearly why sex, in the meaning of the Equality Act, is essential to be made much more clear to end this and protect rights. Thank you.
The Honourable Gentleman has exceeded the time limit. If he can just give one line in by way of a conclusion before I move to the next speaker. He's done. Oh, right. Thank you. Where are we? Sorry. Luke Pollard, sorry.
Thank you, Sir George. In the spirit of calm and cool debate, I want to say clearly, just as people opposite have said, my view on this matter, that trans men are men, trans women are women, and being non-binary is valid. I'm proud to be Plymouth's first ever out Member of Parliament. I probably am not Plymouth's first ever gay Member of Parliament, but I'm certainly the first one to proudly say so before they put themselves forward for election. And I think that gives a special responsibility to speak up for those people for whom their voices are not always heard in this place. I think changing the Equality Act is unnecessary, unworkable, and unfair. When we talk about biological sex, we are talking about the sex assigned at birth as an argument, which means that there is a real complication and a potential assault on people with intrusive medical tests to look at their biological sex at birth rather than where they are today. As mentioned earlier, it also ignores intersex people, who make up a substantial portion of our population. I'm going to carry on, thank you, if I may. Single-sex services can and do exclude trans women at the moment, using the law as it stands today.
Exactly.
Changing the definition of sex is unnecessary to achieve this policy aim, and indeed, the majority of the examples used around the room in this debate so far are already covered by the Equality Act.
Exactly.
I am worried that this debate and the direction of travel in which this can take us could lead to a rollback of hard-won rights for the LGBT+ community, and will potentially exclude more trans people from public spaces and allow discrimination to go unchallenged. I want to hear more trans voices in this debate. And I would like us to spend as much time talking about trans people's rights to use a toilet as we spend talking about trans people's access to healthcare. In the Southwest at the moment, the waiting list to access trans healthcare is 7 years. Is 7 years, a disgraceful amount of time. And I would like and challenge all those people who spend more time focusing on toilets to spend as much time focusing on healthcare and the delays in the system to achieve a fair place for us all. And let me say clearly, the carefully crafted words that suggest that trans people accessing the toilets or changing rooms that they're legally allowed to do makes them a sexual predator is disgusting and wrong. And what it does, it contributes to rise in hate against people. In particular, one of my friends who describes herself as a butch lesbian has been asked to leave toilets countless times. All she wants to do is go for a wee. But she's been asked to leave toilets countless times because of a rise in hate. Now, she was born a girl. She's a proud woman now, a proud lesbian. But the rise in hate in this debate and around our country means that she worries about going to the toilet in case what other people think of her. And that's not right. I'm going to carry on if I can, so I'm running out of time. I think it's important that we defend the Equality Act, because there are so many examples that are already covered by the Equality Act here. I think it's important that we all look carefully at it. Now, I appreciate some MPs have wanted to have this debate for quite some time, wanted to have a debate around biological sex. But what I hope we can all agree on is that the right of trans people to exist, to be authentically themselves, to thrive, to be themselves, should not be up for debate. But this debate, and this is why we have to be careful, needs to make sure that it doesn't go the path as we're seeing this debate develop in America. Because what happened in America, and we can see this, is first they came for trans people, then they came for the rest of the LGBT+ community. As we see from the 400 pieces of legislation. I'm going to carry on if I can. I think we need to be very cautious. Now, that is not to say that everyone in this debate has made that case, but that is a direction of travel, especially when hate is bubbling in our environment. My final thing I want to say, Sir George, is that for the trans and non-binary people watching this debate, I think it is important that one of us says, I see them, I hear them, they should be loved and supported, they should be protected in law, and there is a way through to make sure that that can happen sensibly and doing so. Well, there are trans and non-binary women and trans and non-binary men and trans and non-binary folks as well, and shockingly there are women and men in the LGBT wider community. So let's make sure that we are embracing inclusion in this, because the truth is rising hate and discrimination makes all our lives worse, but in particular it makes the lived experience of trans and non-binary people much worse through attacks, discrimination and hate. Thank you, Sir George.
Thank you. Tim Loughton.
George, thank you very much. I think many people find it extraordinary. We're having a debate on having to redefine sex in the Equalities Act, but people will find it even more extraordinary that some speakers have warned us against having this debate in this place, that supposedly people are frightened about having this debate. There is a problem. That problem has been due to the conflation of sex and gender, and it is this place that rightfully needs to put it right, and it's up to us as parliamentarians to speak out. And as the opening speaker said, openly, fearlessly, respectfully, and I hope also without fear of being cancelled, without fear of appearing in an Oxfam cartoon or without fear of being described as weaponising this important subject. There is currently confusion about how the Equality Act operates in relation to sex. That is jeopardising the provision of single-sex and separate-sex services allowed for by the Act, including hospital wards, care provision, sports and schools, as we have heard. Amending the Act to ensure references to sex mean biological sex would resolve this confusion for everyone concerned. It's about clarification, not change. And this doesn't remove the rights of transgender people who are protected from discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment, and that comes under a protected characteristic in this same Act. The clarification will make it simpler to provide single-sex services and accommodation. It will provide clarity for single-sex associations, including charities, women's refuges, sports associations. It would also provide clarity to schools, which is increasingly becoming an issue. And all of this can be done using Section 23 of the GRA without the need for new primary legislation. So I support the first petition, Sir George, to make the Equality Act clearer for several reasons. And I echo what other members have said, but I want to talk about one particular application of the Act, and that's to allow clear and fair women's sport and to ensure that it gets the support that it needs. It's just over a decade now since London hosted the world's greatest sporting spectacle, the Olympics, and Team GB did us proud. But since then, one sport after another has allowed male-born athletes who later identify as women to compete as women. Around 60 governing bodies opened up the female category to male athletes who benefit from all the physical advantages of testosterone during puberty. Incredibly, that included some combat sports, such as wrestling and judo, which are very physical. The entire purpose of competitive women's sport is to allow girls and women to compete fairly, like against like, to recognise and reward female excellence. That's why we have separate Paralympic Games and separate categories within that to reflect the abilities of certain people. We also don't hear much about transgender men competing in male sport. What we know is that males are bigger, stronger, faster. During puberty, testosterone broadens their shoulders and makes their bones and muscles larger and far stronger. There is no way to undo these changes. They are so advantageous in sport that in every single track and field event, the women's world record has been surpassed many times, not just by elite male athletes, but by teenage boys. UK law allows women's sports to be restricted to females. Even those transgender males who have a gender recognition certificate stating their sex as female can lawfully be excluded from women's sport. This was recently confirmed by the EHRC. But sporting regulators have said that they worry that even with the law behind them, they risk vexatious, costly legal actions and being dragged on social media for being transphobic and exclusionary. A legal opinion commissioned by UK Athletics alerted it to these risks, and it wants to exclude all males from female sports, but worries that it will get sued. Sports organisations also worry that they might not be covered by the exclusion that relates to competition when it comes to other parts of sport, training, handing out funding, running recreational sports and providing facilities like changing rooms. Last year, Sir George, the UK Sports Council looked at the science and came to the conclusion that it is categorically unfair to allow males into female sport. But campaign group Fair Play for Women still knows of men competing in women's events in English football. There are around 50 such males. A 30-something male was selected as goalkeeper for the British University's team. In individual sports like cycling and running, women have lost medals and prizes to males identifying as female. This isn't just an issue for elite sports. It's an issue even at the junior level. Parents worry that their daughters will get injured on the field playing with bigger, stronger, heavier boys who identify as girls. Faced with such unfairness and risk, women and girls vote with their feet. A measure that's described as inclusive actually means that girls and women are excluded from their own competition. Only now, this week, we've heard about the women's angling English team as well. In swimming, many women, including those who have breast cancer and Muslim women, want female-only sessions, but now they can find that there's a male woman in the changing room and the pool with them. And I pay tribute to Sharon Davis and all the work she's done in this area. It's not fair on women and girls who spend years training in their sport only to have it snatched away by competing against somebody who is biologically different. We owe it to the amazing women of Team GB to sort out this issue, and we owe it to every girl who dreams of being on the podium one day, like the women who are her sporting heroes. I support the first petition.
Russell Moyes.
Thank you, Sir George. It is always difficult to talk about these sensitive issues, and by and large, apart from some exceptions, we have managed to do it today in a calm manner. I've not always been the most calm on this, issue because it is difficult when you are talking about people's lives from all sides. And I hope that, of course, last time I spoke in here about some of these issues, people in this room then spread lies about me wanting to teach BDSM to children, etc. Horrible, pernicious lies that were put on Twitter and caused a lot of hate. And I think it's important to note that there has been a lot of hate and a lot of angst outside of this room directed to politicians on all sides of this debate, and it's totally unhelpful. It's probably unhelpful saying it's just me, Your Honour. It's all of us have had really horrible times, and I think it's important to start by saying that. And we need to diffuse that, and I try and take the lead and do that myself. But what we have heard today is a set of cherry-picked case studies of examples and exceptions, but each one of them will have been very complex cases that need complex answers, because people are not simple. People are not actually just binary. Biology is not as simple as that, as I know my honourable friend from Sheffield would attest. More than happy to.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there is a risk in this House to be doing GCSE biology rather than actual biology, because the occurrence of aneuploidies XXX is 1 in 1,000 women, and XXY is 1 in 500 men. These are very common biological differences that do complicate the matter, and they're not intersex individuals, to be clear.
I appreciate that, and from a biologist, I think it is important to note that people are complex, and that's why flexibility in the law, the current law as it stands, is important. Actually, by defining it too much, what you suddenly do is assume that everyone lives in these easy binary boxes. And the current principle of the law, as my honourable friends have mentioned previously, is that general and specific discrimination should not happen, but there are a number of exceptions for people with protected characteristics where actually discrimination can happen to provide specific spaces. And of course, we know that is on gender, we know it can be on race, it can be on disability, sex, not gender, and it can of course be on gender reassignment. But the ability to have flexibility on your determination in each organisation, specific place by specific place, is important. Survivors Network in my constituency, the predominant organisation supporting survivors of abuse, has for over 30 years decided to take a trans-inclusive line in how it treats women's spaces. And that has been through working out what the local need is, through working out what the need of the service provision is. The majority of providers in Britain choose to draw that line on biological sex. Both is legal. Because of the flexibility in the law, both can be determined. And of course, what would happen if we then put a strict rule that the discrimination could only happen according to biological sex? Survivors Network would be barred from the flexibility that was dreadfully important in providing an inclusive service in our city. But moreover, you would have a legal provision that would prevent a trans man going in to use male facilities insofar of a changing room. Now, I believe that we should, in many respects, try and find accommodation. I have a lovely new swimming pool opened up in my constituency. Fantastic changing facilities, all individualised cubicles with individualised facilities. Gender is not an issue. Of course, when we build new facilities, we can develop... I will do.
I agree. I have seen that issue come about where we now have non-gendered areas, or we have a division. But I have to say, I think that there is a bit of a red herring in that I actually think lots and lots of women would like to still have a women's changing area. I don't, and I've seen the solution to it being that the sort of non-gendered.
Before the honourable gentleman resumes, there is a division. So we will be suspending the sitting for 15 minutes.
I hate walking through a tower with men next to me.
It might be worth announcing that the debate, because of the divisions that have taken place, will be concluded by 8:09, and that the wind-ups will begin at 7:39. So if people can bear that in mind. Lloyd Russell-Moyes.
I want flexibility for these things to be locally determined, proportional means for legitimate ends. The current law works, and of course there will be examples that are wrong and need correcting, but that's why we need the government to give greater guidelines. But the problem is the trans community do not have trust that those guidelines will be fair and balanced. But for me, the real issue, the injustice, is the woman tonight that will turn up to Brighton and be told that we have no spaces in the refuge and will be put into hostel accommodation with rapists who have only just come out of prison down the corridor. The real tragedy will be tonight the young trans person who can't get access to mental health services. The real tragedy is 12 years of austerity and cuts from the Conservative government, and not some dog whistle around whether there should be clarity or not. There is. The law is clear. What we need is services.
Jonathan Gullis.
And I congratulate the Honourable Lady for Gower for her balanced and approach to the entrance of this debate. And, of course, listening to all sides of it. And I want to start off by making it very clear that no one here is looking for some sort of culture war, despite what some may otherwise think. So no one here is looking to try and pit two different people against one another. In fact, I firmly want and believe that both women and the trans community have the right to be protected and are protected already well within many existing laws, including the Equality Act, including the Gender Recognition Act, including the Human Rights Act. There are plenty of laws in place. But if we have been asked to seek to clarify the law, not change the law, to clarify the law, then I think that is this Parliament's right to do so, as long as the majority are willing to vote with it. And I speak about this passionately because I understand having someone in my life, a woman, who fled domestic violence, who found a refuge with her young daughter, who would have been terrified to be near anyone, whether they were male or biologically or a trans woman in that system, because of the abuse, the rape, the torture that they suffered with. And this is about them having the safety of a women's refuge, to be around other female survivors. And I commend regularly the Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley for being such a passionate champion in this cause, because having lived with that woman, heard her stories and all the tragedy that she's had to go through, I think it's remarkable to understand why it is so important and so passionate that women want to have the protection of those single-sex spaces, and why it is wholly appropriate, therefore, that if we need to clarify the law, that we do so, to say that sex is defined by your biology, not someone who's assigned your gender at birth. You are born a male or you are born a female. A male is an adult human, man is an adult human male, a woman is an adult human female. These are not facts that we should be disputing in the 21st century. This is the basics of biology that we talk about in our classrooms. As someone who was a teacher, day in, day out, someone who had a responsibility as a head of year for the safeguarding and welfare of children, who taught in an only girls' school, as well as mixed-sex schools as well. And understanding the challenges that come with some of those households and some of those young individuals is about making sure that women and girls feel protected, and that the trans community rightly have their rights and protections as well. And it's befuddling, Sir George, that to people in Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and Talk, this debate even has to happen, because to them it is obvious that when the Equality Act was written, that sex was clearly talking about the biological definition of what is a man and what is a woman. But of course they respect and understand that if therefore needs to be clarity, that we should just get on with doing that entirely. I want my daughter to grow up to look at heroines like the Honourable Member for Canterbury, like the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West, like people like J.K. Rowling, who have been brave enough and bold enough to stand up for what they believe is important, because their rights should not be eroded in order to allow an extremist minority shouting very loudly on social media, pursuing a very hardline agenda that is not in keeping with the majority, as we've seen in this own debate of the country. But sadly, women are being persecuted and facing abuse just as much as those in the trans community are as well, for simply speaking out. The fact that J.K. Rowling, The people that made money off her hard work refuse to stand beside her. The people who sit there in their multi-million-pound mansions, flying in their private flights, trademark off their history of being actors and actresses because of her work, and yet do not have the gall, to cancel her from being present at her own show about the books that she wrote herself. It is extraordinary that we live in such times, that those individuals can be so cold and callous in their behaviour. And that is why it is so important that we therefore bring about this debate, because it's about making sure that women feel safe and are safe in having their protections. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
As the definition in the Equality Act. As I understand it, the Equality Act currently defines someone's legal sex as either being the sex they were assigned at birth or the sex that they have acquired through having a gender recognition certificate, because I don't think that's what he said in his speech.
I want to make it perfectly clear. Sex is not assigned at birth. You are born a man or you're born a woman. Those are indisputable facts. You have XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes. Again, something that is not up for debate or discussion. And to be perfectly frank, it is, to me, and actually for the Honourable Lady who talked about the XXY chromosomes, Klinefelter syndrome, as pointed out on the NHS website itself, that refers to a condition to an abnormal amount of chromosomes, not to this separate debate, which is about self-identification. These two things are separate. And to finish, Sir George, as I say, it's biologically clear that a man has a male XY chromosomes and female has XX chromosomes. This is a scientific truth that should not be conflated with any other constructed truth. William of Ockham had it right that the simplistic approach is the best. Let's keep the Equality Act simple in order to protect the rights of everyone in a civil society. The problem with the debate we're having is that it's set in the context of a postmodern society that thinks it can get away with dictating to those who hold universal convictions of truth that they must abandon them for nonsensical versions of their truth. Whilst the Algerian philosopher Jacques Derrida once pointed out that society is in a state of flux, he did not say that science is in a state of flux.
Before I get into my remarks, I've worked in clinical practice for 25 years, and it is absolutely anathema to me that any clinical member of staff would seek to allow their feelings to trump the privacy, dignity and rights of any patient in their care. Hear, hear. So the one thing that I hope that all sides could agree on in this debate is that equality as a principle is something that we should all embrace, cherish and protect. Our understanding of what that means and how it is achieved is the nub of this debate, and our willingness to either accommodate that or otherwise with each other. I want to consider that foundation first. The notion of equality and its role in law is not new. Going back millennia, Aristotle argued that equals should be treated equally and unequals should be treated unequally. This enduring principle of equality requires that individuals should be treated the same unless, of course, they differ in ways that are relevant for consideration to maximise their equality before the law. Understanding how we differ requires a shared and clear language to delineate and apply those considerations effectively. And as from the days of Aristotle, sex, who is male and who is female, has been the bedrock upon which we have accommodated fundamental differences. As same-sex attracted male, my sex and the sex of my partner is a primary defining characteristic of my identity and my protection in law. Hear, hear. If sex were to mean anything other than the biological category of natal male, it would no longer be possible for me to delineate or describe who I am within the law, or for the protection of other gay men like me. Hear, and hear. This is true of other protected characteristics in the Act, including the protection of the trans population under the characteristic of gender reassignment. I remember when I was first asked if I believed that trans women were women, and I was puzzled by the question, as it implied the need to subvert and subsume the meaning of woman as it has been commonly understood. But not just that. because I see absolutely nothing controversial calling a trans woman or a trans man. These are as necessary as biological categories to society and to the Equality Act to accommodate them, to value them and to protect them. To deny that a trans woman is a trans woman suggests that there is something less, something other about a trans identity, something to be hidden away in someone else's identity. I reject that suggestion entirely. Now as then, I value trans people and respect those who have chosen to make such a profound change to their lives in search of inner peace. But the act of subsuming rights or clouding language around equality goes far beyond those considerations, as without a stable codified language, the whole meaning of protected characteristics, hitherto based on sex, comes tumbling down and risks ushering in a chaotic and anarchic approach where equality legislation based on Aristotle's fundamental principle becomes utterly impossible. Everyone suffers. Children should be free to be their own individual, carefree, special selves, without adults imposing their gendered stereotypes on them.
Hear, hear. Telling
children there is something intrinsically wrong with them is absolutely unforgivable.
Hear, hear.
But if equalities legislation is to protect anyone, then it must be able to effectively describe everyone. Thank you, Mr. Hurth.
Peter Gibson.
Serve under your chairmanship, and I want to congratulate the honourable member for Gower for ably leading this debate. 263 of my Darlington constituents have collectively signed the petitions we are debating today, but these issues are important to all of us. Sir George, at the outset of my speech, I want to say this. Trans people matter to me. Trans people matter to me as a member of the LGBT community myself, and trans people matter to me as members of my family. And most importantly, trans people matter to me as members of the community that I represent. Now, Sir George, this whole debate prompts strong feelings on all sides, and I think that it's important that we in this place are careful to avoid fanning the flames of an already inflammatory backdrop. By and large, the Equality Act 2010 is clearly drafted and effective legislation, and I speak in favour of the status quo petition. In Baroness Faulkner's recent response to the government, she said in respect of changing the definition of sex that it could bring clarity in a number of areas, but also ambiguity in others. This place should always be willing to consider clarifications to our legislation where ambiguity exists, but to do that as a knee-jerk does not, to my mind, strike me as good lawmaking. So, George, my overriding fear is that the change suggested in respect of further definitions in respect of sex would run the risk of excluding trans people from effective protection by the Equality Act. By restricting the definition of sex to sex assigned at birth, we would have a situation whereby protection from discrimination could create a two-tier system. Trans people who are perceived to be cisgender would have more protection under the law than trans people who are not perceived to be cisgender. Changing the definition of sex in the Equality Act runs the risk of creating an environment of unintended consequences for people who don't conform to gender stereotypes, but nevertheless are cisgender. So, George, we must not make it easier to exclude people and safer to discriminate against people who are part of one of the most vulnerable communities in society. When looking at what these petitions call for, I think it's important that we note that changing the statutory definition of a protected characteristic is not modifying or clarifying the Equality Act. It is, in fact, changing it, and changing it in a way which alters its original intention and could throw into question over 10 years of case law. Now, Sir George, the Gender Recognition Act 2004 establishes that a trans person with a gender recognition certificate is recognised in their legal sex for all purposes. It is already possible to exclude trans people from single-sex settings and services where that exclusion is proportionate and has a legitimate aim. Many services already operate on this basis. So what purpose would changing the definition of sex in the Equality Act serve here, aside from allowing it to become even easier for people to discriminate against trans people? The population of trans people in the UK is small, as we have already heard, with only a few hundred gender recognition certificates issued each year. Reducing trans people's protections in law and increasing the level of risk and uncertainty that they have to manage their day-to-day lives should not be the goal of any government or parliament committed to LGBT equality. So, George, I am determined that everyone in the UK should be free to live their lives and fulfil their potential regardless of their sex, gender identity, race or disability. I am clear that transgender should be free to prosper in Britain. Our country has come a long, long way on LGBT issues, further than I could have ever imagined as a young man, and we must not turn that progress back.
Kirsty Blackman.
Chair, and thank you to the petitioners who brought this petition and the member from Gower who introduced it. I want to agree with the member from Plymouth who started off by saying that being non-binary is valid, being trans is valid. I want to start off with that. I'm going to do a tiny bit of rebuttal in terms of the conversation, in terms of the debate that's been had, but mostly I want to give voice to my trans constituents and the trans people who have contacted me in relation to their concerns. I want to reject wholeheartedly any rhetoric that there has been in this room that has painted trans people as predators or as potential predators. There are predators, there are potential predators, but to lump every trans person in as a potential predator is to completely demonise a protected group. I also want to pick up on the fact that a number of people have used the phrase ordinary people when they mean non-trans people. Now, there's an awful lot of people in my constituency who would consider themselves to be entirely ordinary and who also happen to be trans. They're also extraordinary in their own ways, I'm very sure, but ordinary people is an exclusionary phrase when it is used in the way that it is being used by some people in this debate. Just lastly, before I move on to talking about what my constituents have said, if we come out of this debate, Mr Howarth and Sir George, and I get a whole load of abuse on social media suggesting that I don't know what I'm talking about because I am a straight woman, then I will be incredibly annoyed about the situation because it is entirely up to me what my sexual orientation is, and for people to continually call me straight on social media is immensely frustrating, and I wish that it would stop. We've talked about biological sex a number of times. Not one person has been able to explain what biological sex was. The member over there gave a good stab at it, talking about XX and XY chromosomes. I have no idea what my chromosomes are. I have an assumption that they are probably XY, but I don't know. I've not got a clue what my chromosomes are. I've got a fair idea of what my genitals look like and how that compares to what other people's genitals look like. But if we're talking about biological sex and we are requiring that to be the definition, there needs to be an actual definition that everybody in this room can agree with. And it is not the case that anybody has been able to provide a definition on this. Mr Howarth, we continue to fail trans people and we continue to fail women. Legislators continue to fail both groups who are considered and treated somewhat lesser in society. That is the case. We are a room of cis people debating trans people once again, and hatred and bile causes further risk for trans people. What would the impact, Mr Howarth, be on trans people? No. We're already having a situation where people are gate-kept for going to the toilet. We're already having a situation where people are attacked for the way that they choose to present.
themselves. I have constituents who came to me in relation to this separately. One of them said, I'm not a danger. I just want to get on with my life and be able to go to the loo when I'm shopping. And surely that is something that we should want for everybody. Everybody should feel comfortable and able to access those services. They should not, as happened to one of my friends, have their 2 teenage daughters told that they cannot go into a loo because they have got short hair and wear trousers rather than skirts. If we have a situation where people could tell what the biological sex is of someone, then clearly they are gatekeeping the wrong people. Why are they continuing to do that if biological sex is so completely obvious to everyone? The other trans person that came to me, and it's not the first one that's come to me in relation to concerns of this nature, but I'm going to paraphrase what they said. When they were talking about, hearing about biological sex being included in the Equality Act and this change being made, they said, what hope is left? Should I just kill myself now and be done with it? They will not rest until trans people are excluded from public life. This is what is happening as a result of this dog whistle politics to try to demonise my constituents who just want to get on with their lives, live in peace and go shopping in peace.
Thank you, Sir George, for calling me to speak, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I think it's rather ironic coming so late in the debate, because the point I wanted to make and the argument I would want to win was made and won before the debate started, when your predecessor in the chair counselled members that there were 2 live court cases associated with this subject. And my point is this, that we are then allowing individuals to have to operate in this seeming legal grey space rather than us directing Parliament. And those individuals and organisations are forced to run the legal gauntlet case by case, isolated then and alone, and sometimes at very great cost to their reputation, to their career, to their health. So in common with many colleagues here, I rise to support the petition to clarify, not change, to clarify the Equality Act. And the Honourable Lady who has just spoken actually would seemingly endorse that change when she said that we are currently failing trans people and we are failing women. Change is an imperative, because we must be very clear with trans people what the law can and cannot do. And equally, we must safeguard the rights of women to those same-sex spaces. It would be indefensible that Parliament, seeing the outworkings of this conflation, this confusion, did not act. And I think it's a highly relevant point that the lead petitioner, Maya Ostata, who spent nearly 2 years and over £100,000 just to determine that she was indeed covered by the protected characteristic of belief in the Equality Act. Her case was won. The judgment of the Employment Tribunal in 2021 made clear that the law could only mean that a GRC changes a person's sex for certain legal purposes, and that it could not force other people to change their belief and therefore their perception of that person's sex. And yet still, individuals continue to face complaints and investigations in every corner of the land and in every sector for asserting the protections that they have under the Act. Just last week, a young woman with the pseudonym of Maria told her story to the press of being investigated and driven out of her employment at Oxfam, simply for defending J.K. Rowling, mentioned earlier, against being called transphobic. Closer to home, and as a Sussex MP, I saw with horror how Professor Kathleen Stock was hounded from her post and chased off the university campus simply for saying the truth, that male people and female people
are two different groups. A woman who remains anonymous under the name Sarah Surviving is suing Brighton's Rape Crisis Centre for discrimination because it refused to provide a women-only peer support group. And I would hope my honourable friend and near neighbour would speak with equal passion in her defence too. When you look at each of these legal cases, a commonality that you see is not only that the women concerned have to put themselves on the line to try to clarify the law, but the judges invariably say how poorly suited the subject matter is for determination by the courts as compared with Parliament. They caveat their judgments by saying they are not pronouncing on broad debates on trans rights and women's rights. The confusion in terms and so in rights and responsibilities is souring the culture of businesses and charities alike as they wrestle with what is required of them. The EHRC has fallen out with itself over this challenge. The debate in society is increasingly toxic. I started my own consideration of this complex and sensitive issue some months back when I knocked on a door in Eastbourne. And a granddad, after a general chat, shared with me his dismay and heartache. His grandson, aged 5, had come home from school and said that day, "We were learning if we were in the wrong body." This, of course, is a serious question to be answered, but what was really chilling was that he said to me he was too scared to speak. I promised him I would. We must speak, it's our duty, and so I commend that clarity in the provision of the Act.
Well, order. It's worth reminding members that, because there is some concern about subjudice, that when she opened the debate, the co-chair made the statement, "Mr. Speaker has agreed to exercise the discretion given to the chair in respect of the resolution of matters sub judice to allow reference to the cases given the issues of national importance." Anna Firth.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I also rise to support the first petition to make the Equality Act clear for several reasons, but I'd like to use my short time this afternoon to focus on the importance of protecting single-sex bases and single-sex services. I feel, Sir George, as if I may well be going back to the beginning, but after such a long debate, that's not always a bad thing. But I do want to begin, however, by saying that I believe that people who are transgender must be supported to play a full part in society and in public life. They should not be harassed or discriminated against, and I also believe that we in this place must be very careful not to stoke hatred of any kind towards this or any other section of society. However, Sir George, this debate is not about trans people, or more formally, people with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Their rights remain quite properly protected and unchanged. What is at issue is whether the 6,000 or so trans people who have a gender recognition certificate count for the purposes of equality and sex discrimination law as members of their own sex or as members of the opposite sex. Clarifying the Equality Act as suggested would make it clear that having a gender recognition certificate does not give male people the right to compete in women's sports, or to undress or shower with women and girls, or to be employed in a job that involves intimate contact with women, such as the example so very well described by my honourable friend, the member for Northampton South, in hospitals or in women's prisons. Families, women and children in Southend West want to know that when the sign on the door says or indicates female, this is not up for negotiation. The only people who should be in that space are biological women. Biological males or trans women or non-binary people should quite simply not be in these spaces. Like the common law, legislation regarding equalities and sex discrimination has evolved over time, and of course it can be very complicated. But what we're talking about this afternoon is actually a very simple clarification. All we're talking about this afternoon is that when we talk about sex discrimination in the Equalities Act, we are talking about biological sex, nothing more and nothing less. And we know that it's important that the law is clarified, because we know there are exceptions throughout the Equality Act which allow for single-sex services, including, as we've talked about, specialist services like women's refuges, women's prisons, women's health services, but also everyday services like public toilets and showers, etc., at gyms. So, as well as making it clear that where the Equality Act refers to sex, this means biological sex, we must also be clear that the definition of a woman is someone who was born female, and the definition of a man is someone who was born male. Of course, people should be able to express themselves, but the simple fact is that someone who is born male, if they gain a gender recognition certificate, they are not the same as someone who was born female, and they should not be accessing, as of right, female-only spaces and female-only services. Quite simply, as has already been said, if the Equality Act is not clarified, it will be impossible for service providers to exclude a biological male with a gender recognition certificate from any female space or specialist service. Case by case simply does not work. Operating without clear rules simply shifts responsibility onto service providers to make very difficult decisions as to who should have access to female-only spaces and services and who does not. A simple search on the internet reveals the extent of the confusion that is currently reigning. Just to give one example, the NHS promises single-sex accommodation in hospitals, yet NHS England's Annex B policy tells hospitals to allow trans and non-binary people to choose whether they are housed with men or with women. The situation is simply not clear. It's said that sporting bodies set sex-based rules, so clarification is not needed. I would say the exact opposite. I would say that the law must be clear about sex if sporting bodies are to feel confident in setting sex-based rules. I can see that I'm about to run out of time. I will end by saying recently I was horrified by the story of the boxer Fallon Fox, who identifies as a trans woman fighting Tamika Brents. Fox hit Brent so hard she suffered a concussion and a fractured skull and had to receive 7 staples to her head. Purely and simply, that was a man fighting a woman. I do not believe that is right or fair, and I do not want to see that happening in this country.
And I now call the SNP frontbench spokesman, Mari Black. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Kirsten Oswald. I do apologise. I had the list the wrong way round.
Thank you, Mr Howarth. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And thanks also to the petitioners and the Petitions Committee and the Honourable Member for Gower who moved the debate on their behalf today. I'm also grateful to constituents and organisations who have been in touch with me. And I'd like to make a couple of points to begin with. Firstly, the tone of the debate today has been, I think, mixed is the best way that I could describe it. I think some of the language is not what I would consider measured. The Right Honourable Member for Wallasey characterised some of it as unedifying, and I think that that is true. And unfortunately, the tone of conversations about the issues that we're talking about today all too often is unedifying. And in my experience, that is a problem because the people who lose out most because of that are not those of us in here, although I think it was the Honourable Member for Brighton Kempton who pointed out that we will all have braced ourselves before standing up in here today. The people who are most affected are the people who are directly impacted by this issue. And the thing is that the actual outcome of the change that is sought is not likely to make the lives of the people that we're talking about better, because I think that confusion is likely to increase. I think we've probably demonstrated that quite effectively today. And it's going to increase to the detriment of trans people as well as potentially to the detriment of women. And I have to say that members have repeatedly said that they're not speaking in favour of changing the law, but simply of clarifying it. It is a change they're looking for. They're entitled to look for that change. I don't have to agree with it, but they're absolutely entitled to look for it. And I don't know why that is the narrative. But I think if you want to change the law, then absolutely say that. Now, Mr Howarth, I'm a middle-aged woman, a middle-aged feminist, in fact, and increasingly a crabbit one, because I am fed up that women all too often still don't have the fair treatment or the rights that we absolutely should. So let's hear much more about women's rights. Let's hear about our rights in relation to buffer zones, our reproductive rights, very topical today. Let's hear about our rights at work. Where's that employment bill that could have helped women so much? I could go on. And obviously, this debate isn't in that category. But the thing is, my rights are not diminished by someone else having their rights upheld. The things that endanger me, the things that endanger women, are predatory and violent men. So to be clear, the SNP's support for trans rights does not conflict with our continued strong commitment to uphold the rights and protections which women and girls currently have under the Equality Act. I'm not going to give way to my honourable friend or anyone. I've not intervened on anyone, and for that reason I'm grateful to her, but I will continue. Now, Mr Howarth, I grew up in the 1980s. That's when I went to school. I've said it before in here that there were no LGBT pupils in my large secondary school. Obviously, I now know that that is absolute nonsense. It turns out that a number of my very close friends were LGBT, but I didn't know that, and nobody did, because they didn't feel safe to make their identities known because of the horrifically hostile environment at the time, Section 28 debate and all. And my real fear is that this current conversation about trans rights, including this debate today, although maybe we shouldn't call it a debate, nobody's identity should be up for debate, it's very similar in tone, and I think that that's really damaging. We have to be clear that trans people do continue to suffer poorer outcomes. That needs to change, and the suggested amendment to the Equality Act would not change it in a positive way. I would also point out that the Scottish Government needs to be fully and formally consulted on any proposed material changes, including changes on the current definition of sex. Indeed, Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Justice has written to the EHRC to seek clarification on that. And the reality is that recent communication on amending the definition of sex to biological sex does represent a shift in direction by the EHRC, and that shift does not appear to have been made on the basis of meaningful evidence or meaningful consultation.
Will she give way on that point?
Now, Mr Howarth, I'm not going to give way. Mr Howarth, the heat in this debate has only quite recently appeared, and the polarisation that I see taking hold here is very much resonant of some of the culture wars that we see in the USA, where there's a very damaging narrative taking hold that's imperiling the rights of women and of trans people in a very frightening way. And we've heard that there are a range of practical issues as well, if this is the direction of travel, including a real lack of clarity, confusing, very confusing on basic things like, where do you go to the loo? And obviously, people have been going to the loo without any particular issue for many years. So your appearance might suggest that you should go to the ladies, but what I'm hearing today is that maybe you shouldn't. And, you know, how do you deal with that? That's actually rather a thorny issue, and one that is actually practically quite challenging for people. Unless you're going to accept huge breaches of people's privacy, then there is, I think, a very significant unanswered question here. And the Honourable Member for Oxford, West and Abingdon correctly raised the issue of intersex people. And I think, again, it's important to point out that biological sex consists of a wide range of characteristics. In many cases, people don't possess the sex characteristics that are typically accepted as being associated with their sex. For instance, a large proportion of adult women do not ovulate. I am one of these women. And I hear these debates and I do wonder. And of course, we heard about intersex characteristics, which don't neatly align with binary categories. So there's a significant amount of work that we need to do here. And what I think that we need to consider is some of the work that is being done by organisations like Engender, that's Scotland's feminist policy and advocacy organisation. They point to evidence that indicates attempts to amend the Equality Act to limit the definition of sex as a protected characteristic to biological sex risks regression in protections for all women, as well as disproportionate and harmful exclusion of trans people. They made reference to a paper called On the Basis of Sex, which was written by Professor Nicole Busby, the Professor of Equality, Human Rights and Social Justice at the University of Glasgow. And they'd commissioned that work, which clearly concludes the Equality Act's use of non-restrictive definitions is a strength, and as we've heard already today, a deliberate approach, recognising that the discrimination on the grounds of sex often arises in relation to socially constructed gender roles rather than biological difference. And the concern, and I very much share this, is that there is no legal precedent for the definition of biological sex, as my honourable friend, the member for Aberdeen North, noted. And that means that there isn't a way of looking at how we support women's rights to privacy, for instance. And this kind of change could, in fact, have regressive consequences. It could actually entrench gender stereotypes and biological determinism for women. These are things that the feminist movement has fought long and hard against. So these are some of the kinds of concerns, along with the obviously utterly shameful disdain of the UK government for Scottish democracy that have been aired recently when the UK government rode roughshod over cross-party will of the Scottish Parliament on gender recognition. And the thing is, Mr Hiworth, transgender people should not be expected to be treated as some kind of convenient political football for constitutional wrangling. Absolutely. They should not expect to have their identities weaponised by means of the culture wars which are causing so much harm in the USA. And I would say to colleagues, please let's not have that here. And I'm trying to continue speaking despite interruptions from behind me. I think that we should all accept that all of us here who may disagree, we do probably all have various different views on these things. Let's imagine that we are here with goodwill, that we're not here trying to do others down, that we're here because we are saying what we believe to be the case. And I think that if we started the debate, as we did with the previous chair, telling us to be moderate and sensitive and respectful in our language, then that's how we should aim to continue. I'd like to conclude by pointing out that we are talking here about a small group of the most vulnerable people. The honourable member for Darlington pointed that out, I think, very, very eloquently. And these are the very people who should expect their governments to find ways to make life easier and to support their rights. Our new First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, set that out very well when he said, "I am firmly committed to equality for everybody because your rights are my rights regardless of who you are." He said, "My starting point is that I've been a minority in this country my whole life. I have understood that you have to fight for your rights, but my rights don't exist in a vacuum or in isolation. They exist because other people's rights exist too." So, Mr Hiworth, all of our rights matter, and the suggestion that this change would improve our rights is simply not the case.
Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate with you in the chair, and I'm also very grateful to everyone who signed both petitions, and also grateful to my honourable friend for Gower for the respectful way in which she began this debate. I think it's very clear from the two petitions that form the subject of this discussion that there are strongly held views around this issue, as well as from the very large numbers of people who signed them. It is vital that the members of this House set an example on these matters and engage in constructive, respectful and polite discussion on these matters. Now, this discussion is important because, as well as the engagement we've seen on these petitions, relatedly, many are seeking clarity about the Conservative government's plans for the Equality Act. That includes my party, the Labour Party, the party of the Equality Act. It is now 13 years, as many have remarked, since my right honourable friend for Peckham and Camberwell piloted that landmark legislation through this place, introducing, of course, a legal framework against discrimination by employers, businesses, schools, public bodies and many other institutions that many other countries lack and still seek to learn from. Yes, I'll give way.
My honourable friend is making a very powerful point about the Equality Act, and I agree that it's been protecting people for 13 years in a whole range of areas, not just in relation to gender identity, but in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of protection on breastfeeding, on disability, so many other areas. Does she share my concern that there is a wider agenda here from the Conservative government? The Prime Minister said that the Equality Act was a Trojan horse that has allowed every kind of woke nonsense to permeate public life. And does she not agree that there's a wider agenda here to remove all the protections which we all enjoy?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to point out there's huge confusion about the government's position on this. We heard those comments from the Prime Minister last summer. We've also heard in 2020 the then Minister for Women and Equalities criticising what she claimed to be a focus on protected characteristics, saying that had led to a narrowing of the equality debate. A similar position has been maintained by her successor. And yet, confusingly, we've also had then the Prime Minister claiming to back the protections that the Equality Act contains for women. I think to listen to him, you wouldn't think these protections had already been enshrined in law for 13 years, a law which, of course, his party opposed repeatedly when it was passed. And this is important context, Sir George, because we cannot understand the government's intentions when we have a Prime Minister who will attack the Equality Act one day only to cast himself as its defender the next. And today I can be very clear that Labour remains committed to protecting and upholding the Equality Act, including the public sector equality duty, its protected characteristics and its provision for single-sex exemptions. So I want to ask the Minister if she can be clear in her remarks, does she support the Equality Act? Does she agree that statements attacking it from her colleagues risk eroding public confidence in its protections? And will she commit to explaining to her colleagues, including the Prime Minister, that the overwhelming consensus view of the British public is in favour of those protections of greater equality and fairness? Now, on the specificities of future changes that many have talked about during this discussion, as the party of equality, Labour wants trans people to be treated fairly and with dignity and respect. And Labour also supports the protection of certain spaces that are for biological women, such as, for example, refuges for vulnerable women, which are provided for by the single-sex exemptions contained in the Equality Act. Indeed, it's thanks to Labour's Equality Act that it is possible today for service providers to create and maintain single-sex services where that's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. That system has been in place for well over a decade, and many of the service providers I speak to tell me it does provide an effective and robust framework for dealing with what are often difficult decisions around service operation. And we can see that, I believe, in codified form in, for example, Women's Aid England's guidance on these matters. Now, the Equality Act protects everyone, and that's why any changes to it need to be carefully thought through, and why clarity on these issues is important. Now, Labour believes we need to have a common-sense approach that provides clarity for service providers for different circumstances, both those circumstances when trans people should be included and those circumstances where excluding trans people is a proportionate means to a legitimate end. But the problem is that the government has provided no indication of how it would provide that clarity, aside from leaning into the idea of amending the Equality Act itself, something that actually contradicts its written response to today's petitions. I hope the Minister can set the record straight on this today. This is especially important, given that we've heard contradictory statements on this subject from different parts of her government. Now, some colleagues have already referred, I think helpfully, to the recent exchange of letters between the Government Equalities Office and the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. The chair of the EHRC made clear that any potential future changes to the Equality Act could bring clarity to some areas, but potential ambiguity to others. That's why the government, again, needs to urgently explain what future changes, if any, it's in the process of identifying, and why it must also set out whether it agrees with the HRC that such changes could bring greater ambiguity to other areas, and if so, what the impact of that would be for anyone with a protected characteristic. Detailed policy and legal analysis is clearly required before the UK government can effectively respond to the AHRC's letter. So can the Minister confirm whether that detailed policy and legal analysis is being carried out? If so, will she commit today to publishing it so that the House can scrutinise the government's position on these matters? And will she confirm whether or not the government does plan to reply to the AHRC? And when the government comes forward with any proposals out of all of the rumours we've heard in the press, Labour will respond accordingly. The last Labour government did more to advance the cause of equality than any other in history. The next will put equality at the heart of its policies and break new ground for women and for LGBT+ people. And in that connection, in concluding, Sir George, I have to associate myself with the remarks made by my friend for Birmingham Yardley in relation to recent votes on legislation. And I have to broaden her point. We've seen extensive engagement on government benches on these issues, the issues of discussion today. We do need to discuss them. We need to do that politely. We need to do that in detail. But I wish we'd seen, over the last 13 years, the same level of engagement on the government benches while so many women got poorer and poorer, while so many women saw their health deteriorate with now maternal mortality increasing, while so many women and girls have become increasingly unsafe, and while impunity for violent men has in many cases increased. Thank you, Sir George.
Minister Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'm grateful, especially to the Honourable Member for Gower, for presenting this debate in such a sensitive way, and to all right honourable and honourable members for their contributions. I do feel that we should be able to debate these issues openly and honestly without being labelled or attacked for having opinions and views, and should be able to respectfully disagree. And I do feel that on all sides of the debate, despite the reservations of some, that we have been able to do that this afternoon in a civilised way. And I pay tribute to everyone involved. I will give way.
The Minister for giving way. Members of the Chamber will have noticed that the Honourable Member for Bridgend hasn't returned to the Chamber. And as this House is only openly trans member, I think it's really important that we send a message to him that this debate is not about him, and this important debate should be conducted with love and respect and care for every single person who is in the trans community, whether they be in this House, in the public gallery, or watching outside.
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising that point? I spoke with the Honourable Member for Bridgend before this debate because he had some genuine concerns that he wanted to raise, and I'm very happy to follow up after the debate to make sure that concerns he didn't get a chance to raise, we can talk through. But the Equality Act of 2010 is at the heart of today's debate, and it's just like any other legislation that over time we need to reflect on its effectiveness and its purpose. And it's only right, and it's our duty as parliamentarians, to ensure that we constantly review legislation, to keep assessing whether the statute books are still able to provide a framework that is relevant and responsive to the issues we face today. Put bluntly, our law has to be functional, able to take into account everyday experiences and respond to modern challenges. Failing to guarantee this would be a disservice to our constituents and those who rely on it to carry out their functions and safeguard basic rights. It's important that in legislation, work on the ground and in practice means recognising that there are some instances where these protections interact and at times are in tension with the rights of others, giving rise to discussion and debate over how to ensure the rights of all are involved are best protected. Now, currently, the Equality Act refers to sex and a person either being a man or a woman. And a woman is defined as a female of any age, and a man is defined as a male of any age. And reference to sex has generally been considered under the Equality Act to refer to whether a person is a man or woman in law, rather than in their biological sex or sex at birth. Now, for most people, I will give way.
Be very clear that those of us who support the first petition are not seeking to define sex in law for the first time. Sex has long been recognised in the common law, and I would refer the Minister to the House of Lords definition in Bellinger and Bellinger, and I'm sure the Minister agrees with me. We're not seeking to define it for the first time. Everyone knows what a man and a woman is.
Minister.
No, absolutely. And for most people, their sex in law is the same as their biological sex, and it's different where a transgender person has legally changed their sex to their acquired gender on their birth certificate by obtaining a gender recognition certificate. And if sex means someone's sex in law, then references to a woman in the Act would include a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate, but would not include a trans woman without a gender recognition certificate. That said, the Equality Act protection applies on a basis of perceived as well as actual characteristics. So a trans woman who passes as a woman can claim protection from discrimination on that basis. And the debate today is whether that basis of sex based on law rather than biology needs changing to ensure that the rights of biological women are also protected. And that is the crux of the matter that we have been debating today. And it's in this spirit that the Minister for Women and Equalities, the Right Honourable Member for Saffron Walden, sought advice from the Equality and Human Rights Commission as the independent equality regulator for Great Britain. And the Secretary of State set out when seeking that advice that she is concerned that the Equality Act may not sufficiently be clear in the balance it strikes between the interests of people with different protected characteristics. And it's in everyone's best interest that we establish whether the law in its existing format is sufficiently clear, as not doing so, as we've heard today, could have very practical consequences. The continued debate on this matter inevitably creates additional considerations for organisations and service providers to navigate, potentially preventing them from carrying out their functions or indeed complying with the responsibility for equality. Now, the Prime Minister has also publicly given his views on this issue. In April, he said, "We should always have compassion and understanding for those who are thinking about their gender. But when it comes to these issues of protecting women's rights and women's spaces, I think the issue of biological sex is fundamentally important when we think about these questions. That is why we need to make sure when it comes to women's health, women's sports or spaces, that we are protecting those rights." I'll give way.
It's interesting to hear the words from the very, very top of her government. I wonder if the Minister will be joining us in the lobbies during the Victims' Bill to ensure that specialist women's services are defined in that law and are protected in commissioning at a local level where currently they are being let go.
Well, I know the Honourable Lady, from her experience in working in that sector, campaigns passionately on those issues. And as a government, we have done a huge amount in the space of domestic violence and abuse for women as well. Now, the Equality and Human Rights Commission have published their considered response to the Right Honourable Member for Saffron Walden, stating in their view that on balance, they believe that redefining sex in the Equality Act to mean biological sex would create rationalisations, simplifications, clarity and a reduction in risk for maternity services, providers and users of other services, gay and lesbian associations, sports organisers and employers, and it therefore does merit further consideration. But they have, as the Shadow Minister said that it could cause some ambiguity as well. That is why it is important that we consider, both in policy terms but also in legal terms, the potential implications of this change before we take any decisions further. So the government has taken that advice and is considering its next steps at the moment. I will give way.
In doing so, I wondered if she's had a chance to consider the interim advice given by the United Nations independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, who's been very strongly critical of suggestions of opening up the Equality Act and reviewing these positions, seeing them as taking rights away from people who should be protected and are protected at present.
Minister.
Well, as we've heard in the debate this afternoon, there are many views on this issue, and that's why it's important we take the time to properly consider. I'll just finish responding to this intervention, and then I will take another intervention. It is really important that we do take time to look at the policy around this and take in the legal consideration too, because there is clearly a case where people are struggling with the current Act in order to make practical decisions on a day-by-day basis. But what we don't want to do is to create additional problems that, by changing or clarifying the Equality Act, that are not foreseen. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Very generous with interventions. Is she also aware that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity does not speak for all people who have the same-sex orientation? He certainly doesn't speak for me. And is she equally aware that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls, Reem Al-Salem, takes the opposite view and is very much focused on the protection of women?
Yeah, and I think the Honourable Lady just highlights the diversity of views in this space, and that is why it's so important to take proper consideration and time before deciding our next steps. Now, I know that members in this chamber today will be eager to hear updates and reassurances and the kind of timeline around our next steps. But these issues under discussion today are complex, and we need to be proceeding carefully and respectfully, because as we've heard in the Chamber, there are a wide number of people that will be affected by any change. And I hope that members will agree that it's only right and proper that we take timely consideration of the advice that we have been given before coming to any conclusions. Now, I do want to touch on some of the issues that were raised in the debate, and particularly that around single-sex space. And I would like to reassure members that the Government's committed to maintaining the safeguards that allow organisations to provide single-sex services. We recognise that being able to operate spaces reserved for women and girls is an important principle, and to answer the Shadow Minister's question, should be maintained. As many here will already know, under the Equality Act, providers are already able to restrict the use of spaces on the basis of sex and or gender reassignment where justified. It provides protection against discrimination, harassment and victimisation across a number of grounds, including sex, and we're committed to upholding Britain's long-standing record of protecting the rights of individuals against unlawful discrimination. Now, the EHRC has published guidance on the existing legislation, which provides much-needed clarity to those offering single-sex spaces. It does not change the legal position of the law. And as this guidance makes clear, it's entirely acceptable currently for providers of single-sex services to take account of the biological sex of their service users. And where it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, the Equality Act is also clear that service providers can exclude, modify or limit access for transgender people even when they have a gender recognition certificate. Now, when asked the reasons women give for wanting such spaces, privacy and dignity are often high on that list, often because they will mainly be in a state of undress or in very vulnerable situations. These spaces are also frequently relied upon during some of the most harrowing and distressing times women and girls can experience. Their ability to feel safe and secure should always be of paramount importance, and we understand that creating environments where they are protected from further trauma is a crucial part of enabling them to heal. And the Honourable Member for Bridgend isn't here, but I do know, and I hope he won't mind me saying, that that is one of his concerns, and we did hear about it slightly in the debate today, where there, and we do have to be careful that we're making assumptions that one of the reasons that women want single-sex spaces is because they feel of a predatory nature of trans people. That isn't the case. For the vast majority of women, they just want to be with other women. But we do need to be mindful of our language and tone so that the trans community do not feel that they are being given labels or targeted in an inappropriate way. And I think the Honourable Member for Bridgend certainly made that point to me ahead of this debate today. So the EHRC's guidance is helpful for those wishing to navigate such scenarios with the care and delicacy needed. So I would encourage all members to review it, and if there are queries from constituents or organisations within constituencies, to do refer people to that guidance, because it actually is pretty helpful in practical terms. Now, there were a number of members who also touched on the issue of gender recognition and the long waiting list that many people have in terms of waiting to be seen and go through the process to change their legal sex. Now, there are processes in place with the right checks and balances to allow those who wish to legally change their gender to do so. And we've taken action to simplify the process following the consultation on the Gender Recognition Act, modernising the way that individuals can apply for a gender recognition certificate by moving the process online and making it significantly cost less in order to be able to do that. In addition to that, we are opening up more gender identity services for adults. A new pilot gender clinic was opened in Chelsea and Westminster in 2021. We have since established 4 new community-based clinics in Greater Manchester, Cheshire, Merseyside, London and the East of England, and a 5th will open in Sussex later this year. And all these clinics offer a range of clinical interventions that are offered by conventional gender clinics. So we are trying to make the process as easier and as supportive as possible, and tackling some of the practical barriers that the trans community face for those who do want to transition in a clinical way as well. Now, I'd like to close the debate today by thanking members again for their contributions. There are strong feelings on all sides, as shown by the numbers who signed both petitions, and also members of Parliament who fairly represented both sides of the arguments today. The government recognises the importance of biological sex, and it's taken it seriously enough to ask for advice from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We will come back to this place once we have considered in detail the policy and the legal implications of changing or updating the Equality Act. And I want to just thank everyone for taking part in the debate today and for contributing to these discussions and affording the issue with the respect that it warrants.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Sir George. It is our privilege and our responsibility to weigh up different groups' rights, needs, interests and demands as we debate and amend the laws of this land. This is the bread and butter of the work of this House, and I so applaud all of those members, whatever their position on the substance of the two petitions that we've considered today. Those that have turned up to discuss them and those who have ignored the calls for no debate. We are doing our work, and this is a democracy. These two petitions concern only the question of whether a GRC changes your sex for the purposes of the Equality Act and are not about gender self-ID. And also, the purpose of the GRC is nothing to do with what has been referred to by speakers here as intersex. The question of whether GRCs change your sex for purposes of the Equality Act has nothing to do with these medical conditions. And people with these conditions have said many times they do not want to be drawn into these discussions. They have said, and organisations which represent them have said, that these are complex medical conditions. There is no third sex or intermediate sex. And people with these variations on the sex development pathway are either male or female. But what has come across very strongly in arguments today is that one of the purposes of single-sex spaces is risk management. Speakers here have made it clear that it's not all about suggesting that all male people or all trans people are predators. Just that single-sex spaces are an important risk management tool, given the overwhelming statistics in the patterns of male violence. And I would like to say that it has been an important debate for me to lead for the Petitions Committee and also to hear various views around the House, some respectful, some less so. But we are responsible for legislating and we have to discuss issues. I wish no ill on anybody, whether they be trans, lesbian, gay or bisexual, because this is important to me and to my trans community in my constituency, and it is important to all of us. Thank you, Sir George.
Before I put the motion, I think the co-chair who opened the debate, Judith Cummings, appealed for people to deal with this sensitive issue in a respectful manner. And before she left the chair, she pointed out to me that it had been, in her time in the chair, dealt with in that way. And as others have said, in the time that I've been in the chair, I'd like to thank everybody for the respectful and thoughtful way in which they put their arguments. People feel strongly about it, but that's no reason to be abusive, and I don't think people have been. So thank you for that. The question is that the House has considered E-petition 623243 and 627984 relating to the definition of sex in the Equality Act. Any of that opinion say aye? Of the contrary, no? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.